Commission on June 22nd. I guess we'll start with the roll call.
Commissioner Barnes.
Present.
Commissioner Javindal.
Present.
Commissioner McCroskey.
Present.
Commissioner Peng. Present. Commissioner Vigil McClanahan.
Present.
Commissioner Von Neidingen.
Present.
And Chair Chomsky.
Present. Can everyone check to make sure the little green light is on your microphone? And if not, just push the button to turn it on. Thank you. We'll move on to the land acknowledgement. The City of Albany recognizes that we occupy the land originally protected by the Confederated Villages of Lishan. We acknowledge the genocide that took place on these lands and must make strides to repay the moral debt that is owed to this indigenous people, specifically the Ohlone tribe. We thank them for their contributions which have transformed our community and will continue to bring forth growth and unity. The City of Albany commits to sustaining ongoing relationships with the tribe and together build a better future for all that now make this their home. So we are now at agenda item 2, public comment, which is an opportunity for members of the public to speak about any item they wish related to transportation in Albany that is not on tonight's agenda. We don't have anybody present in the room. Do we have anybody online who would like to make a public comment about an item not on tonight's agenda?
Mr. Chair, I'm not seeing anyone attending via Zoom at the moment, so no hands are raised.
Okay. So let's move on to item 3-1, welcome new commissioners.
So we have 2 new commission members. Commissioner Von Neidingen is our student appointment, and Commissioner Vigil McClanahan is our student-affiliated appointment, and both were appointed by the City Council as a whole, following recent changes to the composition of a number of city commissions and committees. And we wanted to invite each of them to introduce themselves, so to the rest of the commission.
I'm Leo Von Neidingen. I'm a senior at Albany High School currently. Excited to be helping out on the commission.
Great. Can I ask all the commissioners to speak into the microphone for not just for amplification in the room, but also so that people online can hear clearly, because the online audio feed only comes from the microphones.
And the record.
And yes, the recording as well.
Hi, I'm Evan Vigil McClanahan. I'm a parent of 2 children in the Albany school system. And, you know, a sidelines advocate of active transportation, I suppose. Biking and bike lanes and that sort of thing.
Great, thanks. Do we want to, Ken?
Can I ask what grade levels your kids are at?
My youngest daughter will be a 2nd grader next year, and my older will be entering Albany Middle in 6th.
Great.
Welcome. Do we want to have any further, I mean, the rest of us have given our introductions at another meeting. Does that suffice? Or
At the pleasure of the commission, we do have time tonight, I think, if you want each one to give a brief introduction.
Do our new members want to hear about us?
Well, I mean, I know these 3 well, just, you know, by reputation from Strollers and Rollers and from City of Berkeley stuff.
Well, why don't we just take a minute
We
each
should
to say how long we've been on the commission and what other affiliations we have that people may know us from. Would you like to go first?
Oh, okay. Hi, I'm Nelson Penn. Really welcome you guys to join. My daughter also is entering 4th grade in Cornell, so I had a lot of interest in active transportation. I am an urban planner by trade, and I moved to Albany 2 years ago, so welcome.
You a drop off, I'm sure.
Ken?
Right. So I have a strong background in Safe Routes to Schools programs in Albany schools. And
Everyone say their name too. Just so
I'm sorry,
we-
Ken McCroskey.
We on the commission can't see all the name tags. Everyone else can see them.
Strong background in Safe Routes to Schools, help run programs at all levels. My youngest child is a year out of Albany schools, so, but I was involved for many years. As you said, I'm a member of the Albany Strollers and Rollers Advocacy and Service Organization, and I'm a cycling instructor with Bike East Bay, and I've been on this commission since about 2010, somewhere in there.
Hi, I'm Farid Javandel. I've been on the commission since 2000 with a break to be on council for 8 years in the middle. And my youngest son just graduated from Albany High School. It was really kind of nice to be part of the commission and doing the things that we do for active transportation, safe transportation in Albany, and seeing how my own kids and their friends and everyone else has benefited from that. So it's really been a positive experience for me, which is why I keep doing it.
Hi, I'm Michael Barnes. Let's see, I was a
Michael, is your microphone turned on?
It's off again.
they used to work differently. Michael Barnes came to Albany in '95 as a grad student, lived in University Village until 2000 when I became a homeowner. Was on the Albany School Board from 2002 to 2006, so I know where all the skeletons are buried. My son graduated from Albany High in 2010, and then he went to Vista, and then was a junior transfer to UC Berkeley, where I would occasionally bump into him. It was very strange because I worked on campus. I was the science editor for the College of Chemistry for 11 years. He graduated in 2014, and I was on city council for 8 years from 2012 to 2020 when I was termed out. Oh, I want to add, I had a bad bike crash about a month ago, so you'll see me doing funny, squirmy things and maybe standing up and walking around. Just please bear with me.
Thanks. I'm glad to see you back here in person. I know it was,
I'm glad to be here.
and you seem much more invigorated than last month's meeting.
Yeah.
I'm glad. It looks like you're
Well, let's see how I do at 10 o'clock.
recovering well. So I'm really happy to see that.
I was wondering why you got a special pillow for mine.
This one actually is a memento from the Santa Rosa Intensive Care Unit at the Santa Rosa Trauma Center.
Did they sign it when you left? Did you get?
And, you know, some of those, the staff were so sweet to me, I gotta say. It wasn't exactly a pleasant experience, but it could have been a lot worse.
I'm Harry Chomsky. I've lived in Albany since 2000. My son just graduated from Albany High, and I'm an active member of Albany Strollers and Rollers. I was on this commission in the teens from about 2014 to 2018 or so, and I'm glad to be back on it again this year. So the next item on the agenda is the consent calendar, and the only,
We have one other presentation item.
oh, I'm sorry, we have the monthly police data. Let's go ahead with that.
I'm pretty sure it's pronounced Lee Shaw.
So this is a report out on reported collisions for the month of May. There was one pedestrian-involved collision. Excuse me. There we go. There were 0 bicycle-involved collisions, 10 reported collisions, in all 3 of which were injury collisions. 13 moving citations were issued, and 2 DUI arrests were made. That concludes the report on police data.
Any questions from commissioners?
Well, can we go back, Justin, to like the second to the last slide?
Sure.
In the one but previous, yeah, there's obviously a big drop. Sorry if, I'm sure this has been discussed before me because these are old numbers, but there's a big drop off from 2016. Is there an explanation for that? I can
Yes.
see COVID, right? COVID is where it really bottoms out.
Yes. Pre-COVID, there was change in amount of funding and grants that came in for citations and traffic enforcement. There's also more recently been changes in how traffic in policing with regards to issuing citations and active citation issue.
Okay.
So before I ask for public comment on this, I'd just like to make the observation that there is a much more in-depth discussion of collision data coming later in the agenda, and if people would like to comment on collisions and particularly severe collisions in Albany in general, that later agenda item might be the best time to do it, but people are still welcome to make a comment now that is specifically about the graphs we just saw, if they have anything to say. Do we have any online public comment?
Chair Chomsky, I'm sorry, we don't have any hands raised right now.
I'm sorry too. Any discussion from the commission?
Yeah, I just want to add to what Mr. Freed said in that around 2016, the staffing did change and the grant funding changed at the police department. And in fact, they did not have the staffing to go after grants, at least the way they were staffed. And also at that time, and since we've been told as a commission that we can't program in policing to a grant that we seek or that is sought, that is sought through this body or through the transportation department of the city, that's only a police function. Just so you know.
Yeah, no, that's good to know. But you know, the old rule of thumb in public sector is if you hire somebody for X amount of dollars, but they bring in more money than their salary, then you should do that. I don't know if that's feasible or not in this case, but.
If I may add, I think in the world of policing has gone through some dramatic changes in the last decade or so. Events in Ferguson and others, of course, that we're all aware of. So I think the philosophy of policing and writing citations has changed dramatically. There's a recognition that writing a citation can have a dramatic effect on someone's life if they're very low income. And so I think police officers are much more conscious of maybe giving warnings if they feel like that would be an effective deterrent for some people. So they don't put them, a citation of $200, $300, or $400 can be a big deal for some people. If they can't pay it, they get a warrant for their arrest, and it just spirals out of control. So it's I think, a progressive step in some sense that people are sensitive to writing those citations today that perhaps a decade or more ago it was more just write them up. So that may be reflected in some of the numbers that you see. I know our previous police chief reported on that at one point that they're trying to be thoughtful about it.
I agree with all of that. And it's also true that we don't have the choice to try enforcement as part of the package of what we're looking at affecting. And we don't have, a traffic officer who might cite after repeated offenses. So to some extent, it feels like that whole piece has just been taken and put aside, out of the toolbox, and for better or worse.
Just wanted to comment that we've certainly had some conversations with the police department in the past, and historically, even prior to the changes of the last few years, traffic citations, only a portion of that comes back to the city. And historically, it has been a money loser when we do enforcement activities. So it doesn't generate net revenue to the city. And that's why we've pursued grants to cover targeted enforcement activities, to cover the cost, because it doesn't net out to the positive. So I think that's a common misunderstanding. We'll often hear comments of, you could, pay for the time, you could hire more staff by doing more enforcement, and it turns out that that's not the way it works. Even if you set aside all the unintended negative consequences that we sometimes have with excessive enforcement, perhaps.
I've heard that proportion of the funds that come back to Albany quoted as low as 17% for moving violations. So it's a rather extreme situation.
May I ask, I heard that Berkeley recently approved to use like a camera at some strategically chosen intersections. Were those cameras used for kind of crime prevention, or are they used in traffic citation?
There's no, other than red light cameras that are currently allowed under state law, there's no opportunity for camera-based enforcement anywhere in the state of California. So the cameras that the city of Berkeley has deployed in some locations are public safety cameras, not traffic cameras.
So I have a question about the proportion of funds that comes back to Albany as opposed to going to the state or elsewhere. Does that apply to parking enforcement as well as moving enforcement?
I believe so. I don't know what the percentages are, but there is, we pay for the collection of the fees, the parking fines.
But does it, so when the city collects parking fines, it has to send some of the revenue to other agencies? It doesn't.
We contract, I don't know who it is now. We tend to contract with other agencies to collect the funds for us. Larger cities that do this. And if you get a parking ticket, you're probably not sending it to the city of Albany. You're sending it, last time I got one, I think went to Novato or something.
So the agency that's doing the operations of the enforcement.
We're doing the operations of the enforcement, but the collection of the fine, a slice of that. Most of it probably comes back, but it certainly doesn't. I doubt if it pays for the cost of the parking enforcement person and their equipment. Those little vehicles are actually quite expensive.
Yeah, and I think, as Jeff said, that for parking citations, it's a processing cost. For traffic citations, because they are predominantly, in fact, at this point, all, I think, violations of the vehicle code, that's a state-established and court-established citation primarily. So that's why, as Ken said, it's such a small proportion that comes back to the city, unless we want to really inflate those. And our point isn't to make money. Our point is to change behavior, and we're already kind of moving in the opposite direction. One of the things, I'm probably going a little too far off here, is the idea that if state law allowed cities to do traffic enforcement as municipal code violations rather than vehicle code violations, we could change from issuing points on licenses, and we could do lower citation amounts or some sort of more progressive. But those are things at this point that are not under the jurisdiction of the city to establish.
Okay. Whereas with parking citations, we do we set the rules.
Yeah.
With moving citations, the state sets the rules, and we just are a cog in the machine of the enforcement. Okay.
To be clear, my point was not to bring this up to change the situation, but to make those who are newer on the commission aware of this on a slow night, so that when it comes up in a larger project, it's not such a big deal.
I think this is also very valuable to talk about because in the later session, we're going to talk about the unbundle for rent, right? That if every apartment's doing that, the city has to take a more progressive role and start to figure out how to deal with the curb space. So yeah, we might return to this topic again later.
Good. Is there any more discussion about this agenda item about collisions and citations? Okay, now let's move on to the consent calendar. There is only one item on the consent calendar, which is approving the meeting minutes. So my question is, does anybody want to discuss the meeting minutes, pull it out of the consent calendar so that it doesn't get automatically approved? Is there anybody online who would like to pull it out? Is there anybody on the commission who would like to pull it out?
I move that we approve the consent calendar.
Second that.
We have a roll call.
Commissioner Barnes?
Aye.
Commissioner Javindel?
Aye.
Commissioner McCroskey?
Yes.
Commissioner Peng?
Yes.
Commissioner Vigil McClanahan?
Yes.
Commissioner Von Nightingale?
Yes.
Chair Chomsky?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Carries. Okay, so now for the substantial part of the agenda, the items under number 5. And the first one is 5-1, proposed amendments to the general plan and zoning ordinance modifying off-street parking requirements.
Thank you, Chair Chomsky. Bear with me a moment while I go to full screen mode here. To our new commission members, my name is Jeff Bond. I'm the Director of the Community Development Department. It's nice to meet you here this evening. What I'd like to do is give you a report on some work that the Planning and Zoning Commission has done over the last 5 or 6 months. This is primarily within their purview of amendments to the Planning and Zoning Code, but the Commission did want me to share it with this Commission, the Transportation Commission, and also with the Climate Action Committee. And I had an opportunity to make a presentation to the Climate Action Committee, essentially the same presentation last night. Some significant, there are a variety of state laws that are evolving in the realm of housing, and last year, 2022, the California State Legislature passed and the governor signed Assembly Bill 2097, which made some rather dramatic changes to parking requirements in California. And what this bill basically said, and it's now in effect, and we're implementing it here in Albany, is that cities cannot enforce any sort of parking maximum requirements within a half a mile of a major transit stop.
Minimum.
There are some exceptions that really aren't applicable to us here in Albany without hotels, motels, performance centers, that sort of thing. So the definition of major transit stop are either, again, applicable to our case, fixed rail stations such as the El Cerrito Plaza BART station, and a little bit of that half-mile radius drops into Albany, and the intersection of 2 or more transit lines with a commute hour frequency of 15 minutes or less. And so at the moment, the 72 lines on San Pablo, the 18 that goes up Solano and eventually winds through Berkeley and Oakland, and then the 52, so the intersection of Solano and San Pablo constitutes a major transit stop, and then the 52 from UC Village that winds through Berkeley and up to the Berkeley campus also. So the intersection of Monroe and San Pablo also is a major stop. So this diagram on the screen in the yellow basically shows in the areas today that per state law we're not enforcing parking requirements. So the discussion the Planning and Zoning Commission started with a few months ago was extending this yellow zone essentially to the whole city. And as you can see, we're already, 75-something% of the city is already covered by state law. And it's a rather arbitrary radius. So you could have a situation where your neighbor across the street or even next door has one parking requirement and you don't have a parking requirement. And the difference between that is if you're doing a home addition, as an example, we used to require parking, people provide parking, or if you can't provide the parking that's normally required, you would have to pay for a parking exception, which was about $1,000 or so addition to your planning application fee. And essentially we were granting those exceptions all the time. And I always frankly felt like it was a little, I can't ever remember the commission denying one. So it was really kind of taking more money and giving them what we knew what the outcome was going to be. So anyhow, I think initially to apply this to citywide was a pretty simple and straightforward idea. And the commission started to dive into it and went a little bit further, and I'd like to go into some of those details. In order to change our zoning code, we also have to change our general plan. The city's general plan is kind of sometimes referred to as the constitution of land use in the city. It's the overarching legal document that we rely on. And our zoning ordinance and our general plan have to be consistent with one another. So in this case, we saw some things in our general plan that were dated, and so we're fixing both the general plan and the zoning code at the same time to make these changes consistent. There were a couple of other things in the general plan, which was last been, at least this part of the general plan, last amended back in 2016, or adopted, I should say, in 2016. So we had an opportunity to clean up a couple of other things about parking. In particular, in 2016, the city council, well, the voters approved, and then the city council approved an amendment to what was called Measure D that set some parking requirements for new housing development. And through that voter amendment, it gave the council flexibility to adjust parking standards for housing. And so we were able to we're proposing to edit the general plan to incorporate that change. And as you may have seen in your packet of materials for tonight's meeting, we have a annotated, edited version of the general plan, so you can see those changes. I'm not intending to go through that page by page, but if you'd like to, we can. I'm happy to answer any of those questions. The zoning ordinance changes are a little bit more substantial, a little bit more detailed. I'll spend a moment talking about them in kind of high level, and then again, if you want to get into the details, that's great. Essentially what we're doing is kind of flipping the story. Before this amendment, our zoning code talked about minimum parking requirements, that you had to have these parking, and you could do a lot more than that if you wanted, but you at least had to have the minimum. And with this change, we're flipping that. So you don't have to have any if this is approved by the council, and there's a maximum. So we don't want to, the idea here is we don't want people building parking lots that they don't want, essentially. And hopefully this has, and there's been some evidence in other cities that is kind of creating parking induces people to use parking, which induces people to drive. And in a city like Albany, where there are good alternatives to driving for some of our local trips, we're hoping that this helps reduce vehicle miles traveled, greenhouse gases emitted through transportation, and so forth, which implement many of our climate action goals. So getting rid of the minimum requirements, establishing maximum requirements, and then there was a couple of, one important exception that we're not touching, which is, well, two actually. The first is the waterfront. So our citizens have passed a measure quite some number of years ago that basically said any change to zoning requirements on the waterfront have to be approved by the voters. So for the moment, we're not touching that. Someday we're going to have to come back and talk about the future of the waterfront, but this isn't the time and place to do that. The other thing that I'll get to in a minute is bike parking. Then there's a lot of kind of procedural stuff that we built into our codes to grant exceptions and waivers to parking requirements. And if we're removing the minimum parking requirements, those procedures are also no longer relevant. So we're editing a lot of those out. A couple of other things to mention. With a max, and I'll show you the parking standards in a moment, but one of the things the Planning Commission talked about was not wanting to have people, if we have a limit on the number of parking spaces, we didn't want people just paving their front yard in order to park a third or fourth car. So there's a section in here where we're establishing limits on the width of parking driveways in the front yard. There is an exception process if there's a unique circumstance and somebody needs to go beyond the established maximum. There is a process to do that. And it was, I think, mentioned in passing a few moments ago, there is a provision of unbundling parking in rental housing and condos, essentially in multifamily housing, I should say, both rental and condo units, separating the rent for the unit from the rent for the parking space. So if you're a person who is renting an apartment, you don't have a vehicle, or you don't mind parking your vehicle on the street and walking to it, you don't have to rent that parking space that goes with it. And again, trying not to require people to build parking that the market doesn't want, the people that are living in the building don't want. We're also looking at updating our TDM. This is Transportation Demand Management. We have kind of a clunky old Transportation Demand Management section in our municipal code. We do need to revisit that to bring it into a more comprehensive, modern form. But at the moment, one of the things that this does require is for new multifamily housing, a transit pass be provided by the property owner to each unit. Question came up last night in the Climate Action Committee, as well as the Planning and Zoning Commission, about exactly how much money is loaded into that transit pass monthly, and that's a little bit to be determined. We wouldn't want to, even if we knew what that dollar amount is, we wouldn't want to build it into the municipal code because fares and so forth change all the time. But I think the underlying idea that we'll work on in the coming months is figuring out, put enough money on it so that people have an alternative, easy available alternative, so they can take BART, take the bus, what have you, take the ferry if that's whatever they need to use to get someplace, as a easily available alternative to driving. We don't want to set it too high because there's no sense just having a bunch of money sitting on a clipper card someplace that's not being used or not. So there's a little bit of a balancing act we need to think through. And the last bullet point here addresses a commercial use, where we used to have different zoning requirements for different commercial uses. And so you could have a building that was occupied with one type of use that had a low parking requirement, and then it gets occupied by a new use that has a higher parking requirement. And then this new use had to scramble around to either find parking someplace else that they could share with another business, or alternatively pay a fee to have the city process an exception to that requirement. And what has become obvious over the years is, basically, if you've got an existing building with whatever the existing parking is, it is what it is. We're not looking for people to physically change the building if they're just simply changing the use inside of the building. So we're removing that requirement. I mentioned the waterfront zoning. We're not going to touch that right now. Another one that we do want to look into in detail, and this commission will certainly be part of that, is bicycle parking. Again, we felt like that is in itself probably some pretty substantial discussion, and kind of some respects a different type of analysis, technical analysis, and different types of engagement and so forth. So carve that off separately to be addressed in the near future. So now to the parking requirements, finally. The first three, this is a summary. The first three are really the most important here. For a single-family dwelling, a new single-family dwelling is not required to provide any parking. Again, in most of the city, because of state law, that's the standard anyhow. The maximum would be 2 units, 2 spaces per unit. For a duplex, a 2-family dwelling, it's 1 space per unit. And then for multifamily dwellings, there are 2 standards. If you're within a half mile of the BART station, which again is El Cerrito Plaza, the requirement is half a parking space per unit. And this comes from some policies that the Association of Bay Area Governments and Metropolitan Transportation Commission are in the process of adopting that are going to be requiring cities to do this, to be eligible for a wide variety of grant funds. So we're just getting ahead of them by a few months. They've adopted the policy, but it's not in effect. So we're just putting this in place now. And that's basically, as a practical matter, it's the neighborhood around Brighton and North is within that half-mile radius. Other locations in the city, as shown on the screen, 1 parking space per unit is the maximum. And again, there's an exception process if there's a unique circumstance. We're all interested in being able to provide some accommodation of those unique circumstances that the commission would review from time to time. These others, I won't go into the details, but we're also addressing those other less commonly used residential uses.
Mr. Bond, while we're here, the third one, is that also true under the San Pablo Avenue specific plan?
Yes, thank you.
So it's only within a half mile, or is it all of Solano, of San Pablo?
I'd have to refresh my memory of what's in the specific plan for that, but I'll do that as we're going along here. I've got the specific plan with me, and I can just pull that up in a moment.
Okay.
In fact, well, anyway, since you asked the question, let's see how quickly I can find it.
Okay, here we go.
I don't do good on pressure. Let's see. So,
Key change. Yeah.
let's see.
I sing occasionally too, but usually it's on key.
In the footnotes. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have that. I'm pretty sure it's half a unit, half a space per unit in the entire specific plan area. I'm sorry, I'm spacing out on the details.
And how far south does the specific plan area go?
It goes border to border.
What's the radius?
That is essentially Adams to Keynes.
Okay.
There's a few little.
On both sides, or just the frontage of San Pablo Ave?
It's on both sides. So the side of, if you're on Keynes or Adams and you're on the San Pablo side of the street, you would be subject to those.
Okay,
So
thank
those
you.
requirements as well. The non-residential parking standards are now on the screen here. Simplified it, we had a number of different uses with different standards. It was, as I mentioned, kind of clunky. And we're really consolidating it into essentially 4 different uses. There's restaurants, the commercial portion of restaurants, which is 1 space per 200 square feet is the maximum. Every other commercial use, so this is essentially anything else that's happening on San Pablo or Solano that's commercial related, is at a most 1 space per 400 square feet. Then industrial uses, that would be East Shore and Cleveland Avenue, maximum of 1 per 800, and then public and quasi-public, which we don't have a lot of. That would be parks, City Hall, nothing where there's any really imminent projects to speak of, but those would be a parking requirement of 1 space per 1,000 square feet would be the maximum.
Okay, here's a trick question. For those restaurants that are using street parking for parklets, does that square footage count in this calculation?
No. It's-
Do you have an example of where something would come close to these requirements, or to put it in context? I'm thinking isn't there an industrial lot that's used as new car parking?
Yeah, the Albany Subaru uses a lot down on Cleveland, at least one out down on Cleveland Avenue, and they use a couple on San Pablo Avenue.
Would they hit the maximum with that, or is that a separate case?
If they came in, well, for Albany Subaru would be an
Just
interesting.
screw up Albany Subaru.
Yeah, no, if they were to come in today and say, we want to put more parking, we want to tear down a building and put in a parking lot because we need more space. They may go over this limit, but that might also be a case where we'd say that's an unusual use because of the nature of their business. But if, say, Safeway or Bevmo or a big retailer said, we need more parking, we want to buy the adjacent property and tear it down and turn it into a parking lot, this is where we would say, no, you can't do that.
Okay.
Whereas before, if this is not adopted, that would be allowed. That was kind of the old school thinking was good, parking is good, and it's okay to tear down a building to make it more convenient to park.
Is there, is this only applicable to new builds, or is this,
This is new buildings.
okay, so if some of these are, say, over currently, it would not, would there be any sort of triggering event where we would say, you can do this, but you need to get rid of some parking spots?
That's, no.
Okay.
We're not changing one way or the other, whether it's get rid of parking spaces or add parking spaces. We're accepting existing conditions as a legal, the term we use sometimes, legal non-conforming. It's
thank you.
okay as is, but it no longer conforms to our modern codes.
But if existing, if an existing property that was in excess of the maximum wanted to reconfigure their property in a way that would remove part of their existing parking lot and replace it with parking in some other part of their property, then, like if they were taking away 20 spaces and wanted to build 20 more spaces somewhere else, then they can't build those 20 because they're already over the maximum?
That's right. I think if, in that scenario, if they're building the construction of a new structure would trigger the new requirements.
Okay. But again, just to clarify, that would be a case where they would presumably ask for an exception based on the existing circumstance, and the city would consider that request for an exception?
Yes.
Okay.
So I don't know. I mean, the most likely hypothetical in something like that would be some sort of high volume commercial use that.
Or like changing a surface lot to a two-story lot or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's pretty unlikely that people.
Well, I'm just thinking back to the old Safeway proposal from 15 years ago or whenever it was that never was really put into effect, but.
Right. That's an interesting scenario because say none of that, they wanted that parking.
But they wanted to put their store up against the street and have their parking behind the store.
In multi-level.
And behind and mostly underneath.
Or underneath, yeah.
Yeah.
So that would be a triggering event. And then
That absolutely would
They would
be.
have faced this maximum as a result of that.
Yeah, so the conventional grocery store with the big parking lot, whether either out front or underneath or on top, would run into issues here under this code.
What about the longstanding issue at 1600 Solano, because we have, parking requires a conditional use permit because we had a very high standard for the number of parking units. So are medical offices now subsumed under commercial uses?
Yes.
Is there going to be who can grant the exceptions? Does the planning and zoning do it? Are there going to be exceptions?
So the project you're referring to at 1600 Solano is an approved project. It was 12 units of housing. I think they're providing 3 parking spaces, maybe 4.
I thought it was just 2, one for the doctor and one for his assistant. No, I'm talking about if the space is just a medical clinic and there's no concessions or waivers, it's just a medical clinic.
Then they could provide 0. And the most they would be required to provide is 1 space per 400. So they could be somewhere between, if I think that the medical clinic part of that was maybe 4,000 square feet. It's not a very big lot. And the ground floor is medical clinic. So they could squeeze in, if they could figure it out, they could squeeze in 10 parking spaces at the max.
But this will be for medical or dental clinics. This will be much less parking than we would have required 10 years ago.
Yes, absolutely.
So in this case, in some cases, the maximum that we're proposing now is exactly the same as or close to what the minimum used to be.
Yes.
But in this case, the maximum is actually lower than what the minimum used to be. Is that correct?
I'd have to double check for each particular use,
Okay.
but yeah, in a lot of cases, it was literally just taking what was the maximum now, what was the minimum now becomes the maximum.
Okay, but in some cases, the new maximum may be lower than the
That's
old
right.
minimum. Okay. And I may be repeating Michael's question here, but if somebody wants to request an exception, what body is considering that request, and how does
That would be planning and zoning,
planning and zoning? Okay.
packaged probably with the rest of the approval of their project.
Okay. Well, thanks for pausing for questions. We'll also have a period for commissioner questions when the presentation is over, but feel free to
I'm happy to.
ask questions page by page so we don't.
Yeah, I don't mind the interruption at all. So just a couple more slides, some things to point out here. First of all, I think the effect of this on the ground is going to be very incremental. Albany is largely built out. We don't get a lot of new buildings. We've been granting a lot of these exceptions along the way anyhow. So it's not going to be, oh my goodness, a year from now, parking chaos. No more than it already is parking chaos, if that's what you feel what we have. So incremental changes. I think it does kind of cut back on some of the red tape and staff time that we have to do. I used to do lots of parking surveys where I'd spend a couple of hours walking up and down 3 or 4 times around a project to count the number of parking spaces that are occupied within 500 square feet. I kind of enjoyed that just to get out of the office, but it was really probably not a productive use of my time as a staff person. It will reduce housing costs in the sense that if we're requiring people to build parking spaces that they don't want and that aren't going to be used, it will reduce the cost of construction, which should correspondingly increase incrementally the affordability of housing, hopefully. It is intended to encourage the use of alternative modes of transportation, and which in turn leads to hopefully success in achieving our climate action goals of reducing vehicle miles traveled and encouraging people to use transit. There are certainly downsides. Don't pretend to say this is a perfect solution. It will impact businesses, and it will be a little bit more inconvenient for some workers who will probably end up having to walk further from their place of business or the business they want to patronize to where they're going to park their car as street parking becomes more important. And correspondingly, and kind of the same thing, there'll be more spillover parking. So if you're a resident near Solano Avenue, there will be more people parking in front of your home from time to time, because there will be less parking available on those commercial streets themselves. Again, this is very incremental, but that's something to be aware of. We have, from time to time over the last 10 or 15 years, talked about parking, the management of street parking. This will probably move us incrementally closer to having to take on that issue of, do we have parking meters? Do we have residential parking permits? How do we make most effective use of our curb parking? And corresponding with that is enforcement, which we already sort of talked a little bit about. But with more management of public parking, there needs to be more enforcement, which involves more staff people, more equipment to do that. And the last thing is just, it's a really kind of a minor thing. I almost didn't put it on here, but the loss of revenue from the fees that we charge people to process their applications. It's not the end of the world. We don't need that money but we probably, $30,000, $40,000 a year in fees that we won't be collecting in the future. I also want to acknowledge some of the public comment that we've gotten. Generally, it's been there's been support, but as I mentioned, there's been concern about spillover parking from commercial districts, and concern from some businesses about the impact of less parking on their business. Particularly those businesses that whose patrons really do need to drive there to be able to carry their products home. Flowerland is an example of where it's, some of the things that you buy in a large plant, it's hard to put that, hard to carry that home. General support for the equity between the projects that are in the San Pablo specific plans we talked about, and the idea of removing the fees that for things that we're kind of sort of automatically approving but charging people for it, which always kind of bothered us. Lastly, one thing that we shouldn't, don't quite have an answer to, but there are some requirements that are important and good that are based on the percentage of parking provided. And the two examples are electric vehicle parking and ADA parking spaces, which are based on the percentages of total parking. So as we reduce the number of total parking spaces, the number of those EV parking spaces and the number of accessible parking spaces would be reducing correspondingly. So we kind of want to think through that, because those are things that are, certainly, particularly the accessible parking spaces are critical to a lot of people, and the quality of life and their ability to do what they need to do in town. So that is something that we're going to spend some time in the future thinking through and see if we can come up with solutions to that. So finally, our recommendation is and asking that you consider recommending to the City Council to approve these amendments to the general plan and the zoning ordinance. Our expectation is that this will go to the City Council at their meeting on July 17th as an ordinance for their consideration that evening. If there are any other questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So just to recap the process that we follow in these meetings, since we have new members, we have a separate period for commissioners to ask questions about the presentation, and then later for commissioners to discuss the issue and make motions and make arguments and any kind of opinionated statements we want to make. So, and in between those, we take public comment. So for this next period, I'm going to ask for commissioner questions, and your question may have an underlying opinion behind it, but we'd appreciate if we keep those opinions kind of as quiet as possible during this period. We're trying to gather information and make sure that everything is fully understood before we go to public comment. So let's go ahead and see who has questions. Michael.
Okay, here's the first one. I think this is just a typo, but in the memo regarding bus routes, there's 3 major transit stops. There's El Cerrito Plaza, there's the intersection of San Pablo and Solano, correct? But then you also say AC Transit, 72 rapid transit stations. But today you said it was 52, not 72. So I'm just confused, because I had read the ordinance leads you to another section of the state code, and I looked up that section of the state code, and so I was puzzled about the 72. Do you know what I can show you on my laptop?
So it's an intersection of 2 bus lines.
Correct.
And so those intersections are 18 and 72 intersect at Solano and San Pablo. And then the 52 and 72 intersect at Monroe and San Pablo.
Right.
Is that-
Here, this is what was in, this one here is bullet point 2.
Oh, okay. So the 72 rapid stop is the same location. It's Solano and San Pablo.
Oh, okay, but it's not the whole route of 72, it's just that particular stop.
No, yeah, you're correct. My understanding is it's the stop. You're supposed to be able to walk the half mile to the stop.
Okay, thanks. I just was, from the map, if all of San Pablo was included, then there would have been a straight line along the edge, which wasn't, so I was,
Yeah, it's almost a straight,
Yeah.
there is a radius. It's half a block here and there that gets dropped out, but you're right.
okay, that's
Thank
fine.
you.
Oh, one quick question, one other one. We do time parking now. We didn't used to, but a few years ago, we started enforcing time parking on Solano. And I don't think we do it on San Pablo. At least I've never seen the little parking. We do it on San Pablo
Yeah,
also.
that's where I get my parking tickets.
Oh, that's pretty sketchy being out there in that little vehicle, but in any case, it seems to be going well. I was wondering if that's what you think. And I see the little guy with the
yeah.
chalk stick all the time on Solano. I usually park, I have breakfast every other Friday morning with Peggy McQuaid, and if I park there, I'm always like conscious of him coming by. So is it working? Do you think the timed parking that we're doing now?
It is, it certainly keeps the
Turnover.
churn, thank you, of the parking spaces. Yes. So you'll get a ticket if you park there for more than a couple hours. I pretty much guarantee you.
The limit's 90 minutes.
The limit's 90 minutes. The route that they drive, I think they end up kind of covering the route. They can do their circuit in about 2 hours. And if they're fully staffed, they're covering the Solano and San Pablo zones about, they're pretty effective at it.
So would you say that the goal is not necessarily to write a citation at 91 minutes, but rather to discourage people who are, say, workers at one of those businesses from leaving their car there for 8 hours? The specific amount of time is maybe not as important as the difference between you parking there while you're a consumer at a business as opposed to a staff person at a business.
Well, my niece had some opinions about this, but I won't share them now. If you go to a hairstylist, it can be more than 90 minutes.
Oh.
That kind of thing.
So those zones are on Solano and San Pablo and at least adjacent to Solano for part of the block, so that there's parking that's not regulated.
Right. It's usually the side streets, it's 1, 2, maybe 3 spaces on each side street. Then beyond that, it's open parking. You can be there for 72 hours.
Have her park in front of my house. Yeah. I'm in the first block.
Well, she's in Madrid right now, but I'll let her know.
Okay.
Right, so we've had a few people chime in about this issue of where and how Albany's time limits are enforced. Before we move on, any further questions about that specific issue? Okay, then Michael, do you have more?
No, I'm done, thank you.
Okay. Who would like to go next with questions about other aspects of the presentation?
How are we gonna enforce the deep bundle?
Excuse me?
How are we gonna enforce the deep bundle process? You know,
In future projects, we would have it as a condition of approval and probably record a deed restriction with the property owner.
also the current apartment stay as it is.
That's right.
Okay. So that would also include the vouchers for the transit too.
That's right. It only applies to project. We impose the projects as they're going through the planning process. So existing buildings, we don't touch.
Let me ask another question about the unbundling while we're on the subject. Could a developer circumvent that rule if they really didn't want to go ahead to proceed with unbundled parking? Could they simply say each unit gets access to one unbundled parking space at a price of $0 and no more than one? Like, could they avoid unbundling in spirit by just setting the unbundled price at $0?
Yes, they could, and maybe, you know, whether it's $0 or $20 or something, you know, there's some, what's the market price? I don't know what the market price is for a.
So the city isn't going to try to enforce a meaningful price for the unbundled parking, but just.
I think if we started to see that pattern, if that started to be a real issue and people were really kind of gaming the intent of the regulations, I think we would try to figure out a solution. It's a good question.
Okay.
I would hope that doesn't happen, but.
How will tenants be able to complain to the city?
Oh, they know how to complain. I would expect that we would hear about that. But I think related to that is how do we educate people about the new requirements? Not only educating we can educate the property owner because they're going through the planning process. They'll learn about it, but how do we educate the tenants is a different problem that, frankly, I haven't thought about.
Does this unbundle existing rental housing, or is that basically only triggered when they reconfigure?
It would be triggered when they're building new housing or reconfiguring and going through some sort of a planning process that triggers our analysis of the parking requirements.
I'll just add the response on the charging a $0. That works if their new development provides more parking than there's demand for, and they're going to have chosen to pay to build that new parking. So having the $0 minimum changes their incentive to do that.
Yeah. Okay, Nelson, do you have more other questions?
The first question is, I'm not sure if this is my opinion or it's a question. It's like, for me, electric vehicle is the vehicle. And why are we still require parking for electric vehicle instead of saying, helping gaining more momentum on the public, like active transportation, like, for example, e-bikes, because it's really heavy. If I live on second floor, it would be nice to have e-bike charging and parking at the ground floor instead of have a electric vehicle, because the electric vehicle comes with a lot of, equity issue. So not everyone can afford it, and there's a certain age and kind of a profile who are really interested of getting electric vehicles. So let me frame it so it's not my opinion, okay? So I feel like this question needs to be further studied, right? And I don't understand the logic behind that.
To frame that as a question from the commission for the staff, can you clarify what this proposal requires in terms of EV parking?
So we have separate from the, from this parking ordinance, we have on the books now a requirement, I believe, for 20% of new parking spaces to be electric vehicle charger parking in new developments. So the challenge, particularly for multifamily, is if we don't have EV parking in the building, there's not a lot of good alternatives right now to charge your vehicle. Chair Ping, you're absolutely right. If it's still a vehicle, it still creates vehicle miles traveled, and they're not perfect solutions, but they're a better solution than in some respects, at least. So,
But because the requirement is framed as 20%, that means that if a project is providing 0 parking spaces, then it can provide 0 EV parking spaces, right? Okay.
right, which means then anyone with an electric vehicle is not going to live there.
Right.
Which
is the choice that the developer made.
yeah.
Okay. Any other questions from Nelson? Okay. Evan, Leo, questions? All right, I have a few. Okay, let's go back to this issue of fees and the loss of revenue from waiver fees. So in the status quo, with the way the code is written, the regulations are written, when do people have to pay those fees, and what's the purpose of the fees?
They pay the fee when they apply for their planning approval for their project. And the purpose of the fees is to reimburse, to pay for city staff time to process their application.
Right, but they're paying fees regardless. I mean, every project pays fees to have.
Is the fee for the waiver of the parking minimum that's currently in place?
Right. So if you're
Which won't
doing,
exist anymore.
so let's say if you're doing these kind of round numbers, I don't attempt to remember exactly what the fee amounts are, but if you're doing a run-of-the-mill home addition, your planning application fee is probably something in the neighborhood of $2,000 or $3,000. If you also need a parking exception, we add another little bit over $1,000 to that.
Okay, so that's a pretty large percentage increase in your overall application fee.
Right.
Okay.
And we're almost guaranteed. You're almost guaranteed to. I can't remember a time when we denied that. It's not, and so it's pretty automatic. It's more work. We have to do. It's a little bit longer staff report, a little bit more analysis. But the conclusion is, you're going to get approval for that waiver.
Right, and if the parking waiver added, in the example you gave, say 50% to the total fees that you have to pay, it's not adding 50% to the amount of work that staff has to do.
No, but it adds, we have to have separate findings that we have to kind of think through.
So in some sense, the old fees are at least vaguely related to reimbursing the city for the work that has to be done.
That's the idea. They are set, and we update it from time to time to capture that. Yeah.
Okay. And with the new proposal, with a parking maximum and an application process to waive parking maximum, would there be a similar fee for that?
Yeah. So now there would be a similar fee if you want to go beyond.
Okay, so it's just the mirror image.
Yeah.
And so in a sense, you frame this as a loss of revenue to the city, but I guess I would challenge that framing in two ways. One is that the revenue to the city was just meant to cover the city's costs, so it's not really a net loss to the city. And also, there may be additional revenue to the city from the waiver of the maximum, which again would be intended to cover the city's costs. And the hope is that this should be a fairly revenue neutral or kind of balanced, cash flow neutral change for the purpose of reimbursing city staff for their time. Is that right?
In a larger city where there were lots of planners, theoretically, we would be able to have fewer planners if we have fewer, if the process is a little simpler. In our case, we have, well, right now we don't have any city planners, but next week we'll have one. So our fixed costs are pretty high right now. So in our case, it really is going to be a slight drop in revenue. And I will say, the other thing I'll say about the cost of the 1,000, the incremental cost, parking is still the #1 issue that people want to talk to us about when somebody wants to do something. So we spend a lot of time talking about parking, whether we like it or not.
And do you expect that if there was an increase in revenue from fees people are paying for the waiver of the parking maximum, that would be a lot less money per year than what you're receiving now for waivers of parking minimum?
Yeah, I
Okay.
believe, that's my guess. We'll see, but
Okay.
that's my guess.
Okay, great. So there were a couple elements of this plan that were left to be determined. One was the specific dollar amount of the monthly transit pass. Is it assumed that, well, let me tie this into my other question, which is about the process of what we're trying to do, what are we trying to do tonight? How does our review of this dovetail with Planning and Zoning's recent action where they approved this, and with the City Council's future action where they will be considering this? And are those holes in the details meant to be filled in by the City Council, or are we being asked to fill in those holes and flesh them out with full detail tonight? Are we being asked to suggest changes to this that are different from what Planning and Zoning already approved, so that our recommendation to Council may be a little different from P&Z's recommendation to Council?
Okay. Yeah, I understand your question. Thank you. As for the holes, the bike parking, the amount of the Clipper card, and so forth, those are not intended to be addressed tonight or at the City Council meeting. Those kind of require a little bit more independent study. They came up fairly late in the process, and we want to get something on the books sooner rather than later, so that we're consistent with state law. And
so is it fair, reasonable to adopt what Planning and Zoning has approved with all those holes still in it and put that in the city ordinances, even though it doesn't answer all those details?
we prefer not to have all the details in the city zoning ordinance, because some of these details are going to evolve over time.
Okay, and when they are settled, that doesn't mean you have to update the zoning ordinance again to put that information in there?
That's right. So I would imagine that to use the Clipper card as an example, we'll put that into our master fee schedule is usually the place we put those kinds of things. And we'll just say, if every year we'll look and see what AC Transit or BART or whomever, kind of decide what the standard should be of how many commutes do you get for free if you're a tenant, how many commutes does your landlord pay for you, and then we'll update that annually with the master fee schedule.
And that update doesn't require changing these big documents?
Right. It still goes to City Council, but it's incrementally much easier.
Okay, good. Now I understand that. So, and then my broader question is about how much should we be considering changing what Planning and Zoning already approved versus trying to align with and simply continue that going through the pipeline?
Well, Planning and Zoning, the members of the Planning and Zoning Commission asked that you receive this presentation. I think that, they gave it considerable thought. They had 3 or 4 lengthy discussions about it. So they've done the deep dive into it. I think if you looked at this and saw some things that you think should be different, if it should be a different parking, for whatever reason, maybe a different parking standard, or from a transportation perspective, you just see something a little different. This is a good opportunity to say, maybe consider some alternatives to the ordinance or the alternatives to the general plan.
And if we say that, does it then have to go back to planning and zoning for more discussion, or can it go forward to the city council and they will resolve the differences?
I would like to take it to city council one way or the other. I think if there were dramatic differences, well, whether they're dramatic differences or relatively small differences, it would be for the council to weigh the two alternatives.
Okay, so it's not like the House and Senate where they have to approve the same document.
Yeah, no, thank goodness.
Okay, that's it for my questions. So has anybody else come up with other questions in the meantime?
No, well, I'll just say, I think the issue is we're constrained to, one, follow SB 2097, but we're also constrained to follow what MTC wants us to do if we want to be eligible for grants. So there's not much wiggle room left after that.
There's not. You're right. The wiggle room really is on those maximums. We have to do the minimums pretty much. We're stuck with that. The question is whether we have maximums or not.
Weren't the maximums determined by MTC?
The only maximum that was determined by MTC is within that half-mile radius.
Okay.
The half-mile radius of the BART,
From BART
station?
Right.
So not the bulk of the city, which is a half mile from the 72R or whatever.
Right.
Just the very northern part of the city that's a half mile from El Cerrito.
MTC's looking just at the BART stations. The state law looks at BART stations plus the AC transit stops.
All right, let's take public comment at this point. There's no one in the room, or do we have people
We
online
have,
who would like to public
I'm
comment?
not sure, if anyone in Zoom would like to address the commission, please use your raise your hand function. I'm not seeing any hands raised.
Okay, then let's open it up to the commission for discussion. Ken, you look like you're...
Well, I'm
Close
wondering
to
if
your
you have something,
microphone.
if you have something big that you wanted to propose as a change, given your previous comments.
No, I was just trying to set the stage for what kind of discussion we're going to have next. I don't have anything in mind.
Fair enough. Thank you. I do have something, Mr. Bond invoked Flowerland, which to me is an interesting case, because when I moved to Albany in 1999, almost half the Flowerland property was devoted to parking. And the owners or the people who run the business made a choice at some point to no longer host parking on their property and rely on the city. And I know that the owners of the business have been active in advocating for parking, but that's kind of odd because they made a choice not to have parking on their own property. So I just have to push back a little bit on that.
So is that a comment to the owners, managers of Flowerland, or is that a comment about this? Like, how does that factor into?
Well, the
what we're
comment was made
discussing
that this can affect the parking available for retail businesses. But it's not the only factor affecting retail businesses. And I would opine that Flowerland is not a great example because of their own choices.
Okay,
That's all.
understood. Thank you.
And other than that, I'm pretty happy with the way the changes have been laid out.
Who would like to express some opinions next?
Well,
Evan?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that I don't, without knowing any of the numbers, I don't know if this is a worthwhile complexity to add to the ordinance or not, but I wonder if there's any scope for sunsetting legal nonconformance of, units over a long period of time so that eventually people are forced to reconfigure excess parking into different uses or whatever. I don't know, like, you know, if that may be 10 parking spaces across the city, in which case it's pointless. But if it's hundreds here and there, like spaces that could be converted into ground floor retail or that sort of thing, I wonder if it's a worthwhile thing to consider.
It's legally, it's challenging for us if someone goes through the proper process, gets an approval, and they build what they were approved to build. We don't have the ability to go back and change the rules on them. And in a sense, nearly every building in the city in one way or another is out of compliance with something today, including everybody's home. We don't go back in and say, hey, you got to fix that kitchen. In this example, I think there are, you know, I think it maybe be more on us to incentivize that behavior. And that may be a more fruitful way to get towards that is, you know, using, let's say, transportation demand management as an example. In addition, if you have a program that's mandatory if you're building something new, and then have it promoted to people who already have an apartment building and figure out some sort of incentive to get them to use it as well.
Okay.
Well, I will say, I read the memo, and I don't want to make a big deal of this, but I sort of wrote what I consider a minority report, because I was reading the memo going, this is just not consistent with my experience as an Albany citizen since 1995. We don't have to go over it in detail. I've got copies, unfortunately. I only made 6, but I've already emailed this.
Unfortunately, we didn't receive that until just a few minutes before the meeting. I've kind of been skimming your comments as we've been sitting here talking about other things, but I would.
Well, I'm happy to
I would
defer
like it
to
if
what.
you would take several minutes to present what you wrote, since most of us haven't really read it yet.
There's no protocol issue with this being late.
No, this is your chance to say your
Okay.
opinion. So we assume that we haven't read it yet, and.
All right, so I just have a few other points. You know, this has been an issue ever since SB 827, which was 2018, that the problem with designating zoning rules based on bus schedule is that you make your transportation agency the de facto zoning agency. So, for example, if the bus system, I'm going to say it's not ACTC, it's
AC Transit.
Transit, thank you. Changes the headway on this route from 15 minutes to 20 minutes, then boom, that little map of that bright yellow spot on the bottom goes away. So, it's an issue, and actually in the document I wrote up, it's a little more of an issue, but I just want to point that out. I hadn't thought about the unbundling issue, but for example, take the TOD at El Cerrito Plaza. There's a fair amount of parking on the bottom there, and the owners of the building want to recoup that cost. So they really have an incentive to have everybody pay, and that would give them incentive to only give people a little bit of a discount for not parking. But as it is, what happens, at least it used to happen, that you'd go by the El Cerrito Plaza parking lot at night, and the southern end of it would have a lot of cars parked there. That's because people in the apartments and other places would park there instead of trying to park on the street or park in their buildings. So there's a way around this that I've talked with my appointee to planning and zoning in the past, Doug Donaldson. You can have people pay for bundled parking, but allow them to sublease the spot. That way the owner still gets paid, and the person who doesn't need a parking spot can recoup that cost. And from an perspective, it's kind of symmetrical which way you do it, but that's just something to think about. What else came to mind?
Can you clarify what
Sure.
benefit you
Let's say-
see in requiring everybody to pay for their parking up front and then letting them sublease it versus
So
letting
one
them
thing
choose
to do
whether
is to
pay?
unbundle the parking. So if you do that, there's strong incentives for people to park on the street or park in the south at the TOD and El Cerro Plaza.
Choose not to pay for the
Choose not to pay for it.
on-site parking.
And that, pisses off the landlord or the owner of the building because now they're not recouping the cost of building that parking. So one solution to that is to continue to have people pay for the bundled parking, but they can sublease the spot out to whoever they like. And so say another neighbor in the building who has 2 cars instead of 1, something like that. And that way, the building owner gets paid, but the person who doesn't need the spot gets reimbursed. So it's one of these issues of sort of designing incentives, right, that economists love to talk about. And I think this is allowed in New York City. I think people do, there's really a market to sublease your spots in cities like New York. I'm just suggesting this is an alternative.
Is there anything preventing people from doing that?
Only whatever might be in their lease agreement. I mean, we're not going to regulate that, but a lease agreement might say this parking is only available for tenants only. I don't know.
So even if the parking were unbundled, if it cost $50 a month and someone thought that they could get $75 a month from their neighbor who doesn't live in the complex for the use of that space, they could pay for the bundled parking and then rent it out to their neighbor, right?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And we're not going to be
So
we're not going to
even,
be privy to any of
even
that.
with the unbundled parking, there's the option for the kind of dealing that you're suggesting, whether it's bundled. or
Right, yeah,
unbundled.
you could, if it's unbundled, you could just park out on the street, so you don't have to pay for it. But there's no parking space there. You have no rights to have anybody park in the building, yourself or somebody else. But if it's still bundled and you don't want it, say, you move into the unit and then your job changes and it turns out you can get there on BART. Then you don't need the car, then you could have somebody
Right.
sublease that spot.
There's another scenario. What if the owner of the building finds that the tenants in the building haven't used up all of that parking that they built? Can they choose to rent out those parking spaces to other neighbors in the same way that they rent them out to their own tenants if they want to do the paperwork for that?
Yeah, it's kind of, I think it's like the condos, down on Pierce Street. A lot of those units are sublet by the owners of the condos, and they're actually rentals. But the city doesn't have anything to say about that,
Right,
correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
The bowling alley project, is that all sort of wrapped up so that any of these changes will not affect it?
That's correct.
It's because there was a negotiated rate that involved P&Z, and it's about 0.5 units per.
A little bit more than that. I can't remember exactly what the ratio was, but yeah, it's more than 0.5.
Okay, so that's not going to change.
But it's not going to change.
Okay. From doing Blue Glove Crew, I was just thinking as Ken was talking, what kind of businesses, if I rode my bike on down to Solano, could I not bring home on my bike? That would be, if you're doing laundry, dry cleaning, flowers. I mean, there's several examples of buildings or businesses that would be tough to access via a bicycle. Although Flowerland is, I think, the most vocal, for sure. E-bikes, a lot in the news about e-bike fires. There's just a bad one in New York City that I think maybe actually caused some fatalities. Something to keep in mind. I know I've been cognizant of that for years because there's a chemical engineer at UC Berkeley who's been working on this problem for years. It goes all the way back to Boeing in the 787 when those were catching on fire. That's an expensive fire. Okay, that's it. So we can just go over this briefly. I only made 6 copies, but maybe the guys at the end can share it.
I think at least some of us have it on our screens.
Oh,
We probably don't all need it.
how did it get on your screen?
I've got it on my screen.
Oh, you put it up.
2 copies.
Does anybody need copies then?
I don't know.
I thought you were going to summarize your
They
comments.
will need a copy.
Yeah, well, you can have these or take them or leave them. I mean,
Okay.
they're available online.
But will you just kind of talk through the
Yeah, I'll go
general
fast.
ideas in this? For
I was mostly struck that the memo isn't consistent with my experience. So look, I've often said when I was on council, every council needs a token grumpy technocrat. So that's often been my role. So that's kind of the role I'm playing here today. First of all, since I got off the council, I've been very involved with sort of statewide groups of local electeds who watch all the bills coming out of Sacramento. I have very little respect for our state government's housing policy. I'll start out. I think a lot of it is really bait and switch. The classic example for me is SB 35, which was first billed as a streamlining bill that would encourage affordable housing. But then about a year or two later along came SB 828, which created under the RENA process. Sorry, there's a lot of acronyms here. That's a state process. It creates housing targets. It created wildly inflated goals for market rate housing. In effect, what that did is it converted SB 35 from targeting affordable housing to targeting market rate housing. Because if you don't meet these very elevated goals, then all your market rate housing gets streamlined. And I've written about this a lot on my city council blog. But 2079 is another bait and switch. And if you don't believe me, I quote at the end an interesting article from California Policy and Development Review, which is an expensive insider's subscription-only source of information, where the author and Michael Manville, who's a UCLA professor, talk about this, how we don't really care about the transit stuff. Let's just go ahead and do this and make it citywide.
Let me just break in and clarify for people listening that 2079 is...
I'm sorry, 2097.
2097 is the state law that requires us to remove our parking minimum
Correct.
from most of the city.
It's right up there, and my apologies.
There it is. Okay.
There's a typo in my thing. I switched 9 and 7 around.
Thanks.
So the first thing I do is quote the transportation element or general plan. And it points out, for example, that 96% of households in the city own at least one car, and I think 58% own 2 or more, 1 or 2. Let me double check. 58% of the city's households have 2 or more cars. So this is a town that has a lot of cars. And we have to ask ourselves, how realistic is it that we're suddenly going to be able to handle an influx of people who don't want to have cars and don't drive? Because if you live in apartments with 0 parking, but you have a car, they're going to end up on the street. So I'm just trying to suggest that we be realistic about that. And part of the reason I'm realistic about that is because I used to live on Capitol Hill in Seattle for 2 years, which was way overparked. It would take me 20 minutes sometimes to find a parking space, and that would be a quarter of a mile from my house. And the next morning you get up and you have to try to drive to your van pool pickup spot, and it's like, where did I park? And
Michael, was that a permit zone?
No,
Okay, thank you.
but that's a thought. There is also neighbors or other friends who live in the inner Richmond, and it's much the same problem there when I try to go visit them. So I have a fair amount of experience with overparked neighborhoods, and something to really think about is to what extent we could really control that with various permitting schemes, because we discussed this several times, maybe not several, 2 or 3 times in the years I was on council, and it's tough when you have someplace like Solana where you have a lot of restaurants and a lot of turnover and a lot of traffic all throughout the day. Maybe less of a problem on San Pablo. I think the degree that parts of Albany are overparked varies a lot from block to block, and I do think in an ideal world, that would be up to a traffic or Transportation Commission of Planning and Zoning to evaluate how much a neighborhood is overparked and how much parking a new building should have to have. And there's an argument, well, cities tend to be too liberal in setting high standards for required parking, but it doesn't necessarily follow from that the ideal number is 0. I don't think it's 0. And I think the state's interference, is kind of a one-size-fits-all approach, and so we'll see how well it works. Also, the document, and I've had a couple of conversations with some of our mom and pop landlords, leaves the impression that low-income people don't need cars. That may be true for graduate students, although there's plenty of parking in University Village. But the reality is, for many blue-collar, low-income workers, they need cars for their jobs, and that includes people, construction workers, people who do yard work, house cleaners, home health care aides. These are people who do not have a defined job site, and they need their cars because they have to drive around from site to site. And I do point out that I think many of these workers are Latino or Latino, and they tend to live in Richmond. Richmond is interesting because although it is pretty much a blue-collar city, 2/3 of its housing units are single-family homes. And Richmond is now 43% Hispanic, 20% Black, and only about 18% white non-Hispanic, according to the ACS, the American Community Survey. Let's see, what else do I want to mention? Oh yeah, along these lines, I am now officially a handicapped person. I can't ride my bike. I can't walk that far, although I did walk to Solano and back today. I'm getting better. And as a disabled person, it's been my experience and the experience of my son, who got T-boned on his motorcycle 8 years ago and had a broken femur. So we're pretty used to temporarily disabled people in my household, that you rely more on your car if you're disabled, not less. I mean, I am so grateful I have a car, and there's designated handicap parking spots on Solano that I've kind of scoped out, because I would just be housebound if it wasn't for that. So then there's one issue that, it's a funny issue, but that report, that memo we got completely neglects the idea that people have guests. And if you live in an apartment complex where there's no parking, there's no guest parking, and the streets are pretty parked up, it's hard for you to have guests. And let me give you the example where that's really germane. 555 Pierce, the towers, were built before the implementation of Measure D, and they only have one parking space per unit. Whereas the newer condos, 545 and 535, were built after Measure D, which was about 1977. I can't remember exactly what year. And they were required to have 2 parking spaces per unit. And I've had friends down at 545, and this particular friend had 1 car. So if you want to have your guests come over and you live in 545, you basically have a designated visitor spot just for your friends. And whereas in 555, it's kind of a scramble, I think, to find parking when you're down there. There's not a lot of street parking. There's not a lot of guest parking. So I've suggested in the past that that's an interesting natural experiment. So here we have some units that have 2 parking spaces. And when I was in 545, it didn't look parked up at all. But it was around dinner time typically, not in the middle of the night. Then there's 555, It would be interesting to go look at the parking spaces, talk to people, see what their perceptions are of what would be enough parking. Because there's not a lot of street parking, and it's not really well served by transit either. And why this is germane is also, there is a spot to the south of the condos where over the years we've tried a lot to get something built. It's a steep hillside. There's a problem with another 70s era measure called Measure K. We would need to overturn that, but I think the general consensus is we'd like to see some density at the bottom and then have the upper part of that lot become part of Albany Park. So I think it would be nice to know whether one parking space per unit is sufficient or should do something else, because maybe someday, we've been trying for years, maybe someday that will become a reality, and we'll have to think about it. And I think, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, our affordable housing project down there on Cleveland, which has no kind of public transit service at all, has about a 1-to-1 parking ratio. Is that right? So stuff to keep in mind. I think there was a comment that I thought was a little insensitive in the memo about blind people don't need parking spaces. And I'm like, well, if I was a blind person, I would love to have a parking space, because then my friends could easily come in and drop in on me. And if I'm blind, I can't really travel that easily. So, you know, there's issues around this stuff that I thought people could consider more. And then at the end, I quote this long article from California Policy and Development Review, and because it's paywalled, I quoted it fairly at length because you can't go and look it up yourself. But Josh Stevens is the author, and he's talking to Michael Manville, who's a UCLA planner kind of guy. And they pretty much openly admit that transit-oriented development was not a big deal for them. 2097 is something that, you know, reduces parking minimums and makes buildings cheaper, and they're like, oh, we don't care about transit. You know, it was really another bait and switch from the start. Because now there's talk about just if we have this, you know, doom loop problem, as we seem to now with BART and other public transit, and say, you know, the 15-minute headway goes away, they're like, well, let's just do it anyway, you know, and so in other words, my thing is, I have seen a lot of this kind of cynicism from Sacramento. I think a lot of these bills are really about making it cheaper for developers to build, and they're not really about encouraging public transportation or encouraging affordable housing. And so, you know, I don't know how I'm going to vote on this. I think I just wanted in the public record some sort of protest, some minority report. So I wrote this up over the last couple of days. So that's.
Can I ask you a question before we dive into discussing a lot of the issues that you brought up? You aren't necessarily being asked tonight to vote yes or no on this proposal. It's been made clear to us that we can propose something different if that's what we choose. Can I ask you what you would propose to do with Albany's regulations? Are you proposing that maybe we should leave them exactly the way they are, or are you proposing modifying this?
Right, well, as Jeff told us, look, I accept the fact that we have to adopt 2097. I don't like it, but I don't think, for example, we should propose that we not accept it and have a lawsuit. With some of the arena stuff, there are some cities who are going there. Huntington Beach is an example. There are some lawsuits against implementation of SB 9. But I'm not suggesting that. I'm saying, even though we don't like it, there's good reasons to conform with AB 2097 and whatever MTC requirements are for grants. And there's very little wiggle room, as Jeff mentioned. But basically what I wrote is a statement that says, I know we have to do this, but we don't have to like it. I suggest we do this. I might vote no as a protest because you don't need my vote anyway. But I think it's just important to keep in mind there's good reasons not to like this kind of top-down approach from the state. I think there was an implicit promise made from the state is, oh, you get these burdensome rules and these local governments out of the way, and we'll see that a lot of housing gets built. Well, you know, the state has not kept its half of that bargain. Housing is not getting built very fast. And there's a lot more we could say about that, but that's not an issue today. So my point is that, yes, we should go ahead and implement this because that's a rational thing to do. But just keep in mind that we don't have to like it or think it's really a great policy.
So I hear you saying that you might vote no on this proposal, but you expect the commission to vote yes on it.
Oh, yeah.
But
Well, I think
can I ask you to think about suggesting a proposal that you would vote yes on and give us that as an alternative to consider? Like if we didn't have this planning and zoning document in front of us and we could say, we're going to modify Albany's regulations to either conform with new state law or not. You've made it clear that you don't want to not conform with state law.
Yeah.
So do you see a way to conform with state law that you would vote yes
No.
on? Or would
What I
your
really-
protest vote
if I-
hold no matter what?
do a no protest vote. It's just, for me, it's inserting a little flag in the historical record. So 6 months or 6 years or 20 years from now, somebody can go back and look and say, oh, 2097, that was a disaster, didn't work out. Did anybody, oh, this guy voted no back in Albany, California in 2023. So
Okay.
I want some objections, some, kind of a minority report in the public record. That's all I'm after.
So
I don't
that-
think I'm not going to persuade you guys not to vote yes on this. I would think that's a mistake. I think you ought to vote yes on it, but we don't all have to vote yes on it.
That's a really unusual way to frame your comments. but thank you
it's
for.
not that unusual in the legislature. Like, there are legislators who are opposed to certain bills, but they want to look good. So if they see that there's enough votes for the bill to fail, they'll vote yes on it anyway because it's not going to cost them anything. There's a lot of this kind of stuff.
Of course, but here, you're not just being asked to take a yes or no vote here. We can write whatever proposal we want, whatever recommendation we want to the city council, and it sounds like you're opting out of the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, I think 2097 is too broken. It's not
Okay.
something we're going to fix.
Okay, as long as you're clear that you're opting out.
Yeah.
Okay,
Oh, yeah.
thank you.
So if I might, maybe I can add a slightly different twist on that,
Right.
which is, I'll start with, first of all, thank you to staff for a good report, pros and cons. I think you laid out a lot of really important stuff. And Michael, appreciate hearing the overall concerns. So my inclination is AB 2097, we need to vote for the parking minimums. The specific numbers, I don't have a particular issue with. I'm not a big fan of parking maximums. I worry that they will tie our hands in ways that we might not anticipate, in the same way that when I remodeled my house and I had to put in compact fluorescent fixtures of a very specific type in the bathroom so I couldn't replace them with incandescent, now I can't replace them with LED. So it was well-intentioned, but it turned out that those are now the least efficient lighting fixtures in my house. I don't want to do the same thing with our parking standards. So with that, kind of my likely preferred vote is let's approve the minimums, let's drop the maximums. And here's kind of my thoughts based on the presentation and some of the questions we've heard. I think that the parking burden, if we eliminate parking on-site, moves on to the street. That means more competition for curb space, which is not just parking, but also parklets, bike lanes, landscaping, green infrastructure for water treatment. I don't think it has any direct impact on gas versus electric car use or ownership. There is pressure to reduce vehicle ownership once the curb capacity is reached. Some places we're there, some places we're not yet. As Jeff mentioned, parking management is going to become necessary once we start hitting those parking capacities on street. I think this does provide incentive to use bikes when parking becomes more scarce, but it also reduces the opportunity to build bike infrastructure, bike lanes in particular, because the competition is going to become more fierce, and people who own cars and maybe aren't as mobile, and they've been here 30, 40, 50, 60 years, are not going to have the same sense of flexibility as someone who moves here next year. I think the EV charging challenges, 20% of 0 is 0, that's not great for EV charging. So maybe we want a separate EV charging requirement. That's, I think, a question for another time. I don't want to tackle that tonight. I just want to flag that there's going to be things we need to follow up on later. Parking time management, as was mentioned, on Solano we've got a certain number of short-term parking spaces, a bunch of 90-minute parking spaces, and then around the corner unlimited parking within the neighborhood. And that's something that through the commission years ago, we did that refinement. We went from 1 hour spaces across the board to, we made some of them short-term, some of them longer term than 90 minutes. We'll be doing more of that. Parking meters may have to come into it. That's an expense, a challenge. Parking permits get really interesting because they become either residential preferential, and now we're being exclusionary, and that includes some of the service folks that have been mentioned in the discussion coming in to do gardening, housekeeping, whatever it might be. And I've experienced firsthand in managing some of Berkeley's parking permit program that can be really much more complex than it seems at first glance. Unbundled parking, as Justin mentioned, works best if there's less than one space per unit, because then you're not automatically giving one to everybody. Only the people who really need it are going to pay the extra fee. The building can rent it out to anybody once it's unbundled. That's kind of the point of it, and certainly better for efficiency. Just want to acknowledge neighborhood complaints about projects without parking have been standard always, and they're not going to go away. So we just recognize that that's going to become more prevalent as we have some projects come in without parking, and the project proponent is going to propose 0 parking where they think they can save money on construction, build more units, sell more units, or rent more units, whatever it might be. And there's good policy reasons for that. It potentially reduces the cost of housing, and that's a good thing. So that's the upside. But I do think in general we're going to have to tackle more policies in future dealing with the consequences of this one. And as long as we recognize that, I'm fine with proceeding. I do want to mention, and this is not even such a long-term shift, but one that we're going to see more and more for the people who don't want to own a car within their household but need to go buy big stuff. We've already got car share. That's the solution, but it's something that's going to take a while to become more prevalent and be adopted by everyone. So I don't think these are insurmountable, but there's going to be growing pains associated with it. So anyway, reiterating my starting point, I think we should move forward with the parking minimums because I'm not going to critique AB 2097. For me, that's not the purpose of our discussion tonight, but I'd like to drop the parking maximums.
Before we go on to other people's comments, I would like to follow up on the parking maximum question because that's one that rubbed me the wrong way a little bit too. The staff, the memo that was included had a lot of justifications for different points of view, and a lot of them were very familiar to me from having read Donald Shoup. And a lot of them I agreed with very strongly, but there was nothing in the memo about what is the benefit of a parking maximum. And I'm curious if somebody has why a city should have a parking maximum. I think Fareed has given us a pretty good reason why not to have it. I think the example of the light bulbs is very well taken, and I have the same problem in my house. And it seems like a case where maybe the flexibility in the market is really the best tool for this job of figuring out how much parking, how much of our private space should be devoted to parking as opposed to other things that we value So what's the counter argument? What's the justification that we should have a parking maximum, and anybody, Pareed or anybody else?
I'll share, others may have their thoughts, but this is kind of reiterating what I've heard, is that, businesses will expect that they need lots of parking, and they'll build too much parking and use up too much land, and we won't get the kind of density that we want. That's the argument. My personal thought is, anyone who's building parking's expensive. You're not going to build more than you really need. Now, that's a guess, it's a projection. If suddenly, 10, 20 years from now, car ownership goes way down, and we've got this infrastructure that's in place that we didn't need all that parking, maybe we did when we built it, but 20 years later we don't. I don't know how likely that is. If everyone's just going to switch from internal combustion engines to electric cars, the parking demand won't change, but I can't foresee every possibility of the future. I also think we can, remodel spaces. Parking spaces can be turned to something else, or we just do more bike parking or whatever it is. What's coming next might still be able to use that space. So in other words, there's arguments both ways, and some of it is sort of future proofing against an assumed outcome of the future. That's, we won't need all these cars in the future, but I'm not convinced that that's going to happen.
Maybe a good analogy to that might be Salesforce in 2020 that nobody foresaw.
So,
Although
But I don't know that
building something on a parking lot is a lot easier than retrofitting the Salesforce tower to be condos.
condos, yeah. Also, I don't know that any governing body could have predicted the big societal change in 2020 any better than the market, than the developers did, so.
just a quick question for Jeff. If we don't follow MTC's guidance on parking maximums and we do not, adhere to their guidelines, how is that going to play out over the next couple of years? Do they say you're not getting any grants? Tough luck.
They haven't provided details, but one of the major grant programs in the Bay Area is called One Bay Area. Their intent is to, in order to be eligible for those grants, and that's mostly transportation and some housing, I think, you would need to comply with at least the half a parking space in that half-mile radius on the north part of the city.
And that has to be written into the city regulations, not just a project-by-project basis?
That's right. We would need to amend the zoning code, which we could limit the maximum area to just that. We could draw that map and have some special parking overlay zone for that particular
Basically
area.
on Brighton, in the Brighton neighborhood, we would have the parking maximum, and elsewhere we would have developer's choice.
Right. I'm sorry I don't have a good diagram of that right now, but it's essentially takes a little bite out of south of Brighton, but it's mostly that apartment area north
So
of.
that's a way that we could write the code so that we are eligible for all the grants, we're compliant with 2097, and we give developers as much flexibility as possible.
Right.
Okay. I, for one, would like to consider that as an option for us to approve tonight. And I'd like to hear others' thoughts about the merits of going with the parking maximum citywide versus going with the parking maximum only in that northern sliver.
I'm still chewing on this analogy with the bathroom lights. So that sounds like something that was very specific, and in that case, you know, if you had extra electrons, I don't know what you want to call it, you couldn't park them on the street, but in this case, you can, and we have a process to go outside of the maximums, as I understand it. So it seems like a very different situation to me.
Whereas with the light bulbs, there wasn't really a process to get a variance from that.
Right, that's what I'm implying, yes.
How about railroad gauges? You know, that's a classic, railroad gauges. That's a classic example of historical lock-in where the United States has a railroad gauge. It's too narrow to be efficient, but we're locked in. Whereas in the Soviet Union, I guess they have like a much wider gauge so they can carry more freight. But when you come together, the rail lines come together, everybody has to get off one train and jump on another train.
You also have to have
could
much
figure out
wider
a way.
radiuses. There are lots of issues, but
The Swiss could figure out a way to build their train so that it just modifies its wheel gauge midstream, and
That would be rough.
seamlessly
But I mean,
transitions from one
that
track.
process is called historical lock-in, and there's other examples.
There's no parking. There's no parking problem, at least in my neighborhood, most of the day, most of the evening as well.
Yeah, the metric, it's rule of thumb, I'm not sure it's based on any science, but it's 85, anything that's 85% occupied is considered full. And that means that there's not enough parking. You start to get annoyed, I guess, that you have to drive a little further than you would like to, is the idea. When we've done parking surveys throughout the city, normally I see it in the 60 to 70% occupancy range these days. There are some exceptions. The closer you get to Solano Avenue and the closer you get to Berkeley, particularly on Solano Avenue, because people park on the Albany side because we don't have the parking meters that they have in Berkeley. So there are some hot spots there. There are some hot spots right around here, this building, because of we don't have enough parking for visitors and staff here. But for the most part, just kind of throwing a dart at a random neighborhood in Albany, I would say it's around 60 or 70% occupied.
Yeah, I mean, I was just reflecting on your statement earlier that we're mostly built out. Like the density changes in Albany are going to be slow. So, I personally have no real feeling for whether maxima are important or not. I find myself not really caring very much. But I'm just wondering if it's entirely irrelevant because it's a problem 50 years from now or 100 years from now rather than right around the corner.
And we can change the regulations easily before 50 years are up.
Yeah.
But we can't change the built environment so easily. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I guess I don't, it's hard to have a gauge for the impact without knowing, well, now we know roughly how dense the parking is, but like understanding the turnover of buildings, the various rates that things are changing, the increase in population over time or lack thereof might give us some better feeling for whether it's likely to be impactful at all, and if so, on what time scale.
I guess I'm in favor of the maximums. I think it makes sense to, conform, be qualified for the grants, but at the same time, make it equitable across the city. The examples were people who live across the street from one another who might be under a different rule. That doesn't seem fair either.
Yeah, I agree. If we do this maximum parking, we should do it citywide. I don't have a direct reasoning, but let's take an experience. I think everyone here has experience for, which is, you too. Biking to schools, right? Everyone understands sending your kids to school. We should make it as convenient as possible. How to define convenient in this country? You have plenty of place to park, plenty of space on the road, but when everyone trying to do that, we just don't have the infrastructure, right? So some of us, I think most of us here, has benefited from, let's change to bike. And so this little change really bring a lot of improvement to the quality of life, but it's really hard to tell other people. Unless they try it. So I'm not sure if this is a good kind of example, but I think setting the maximum, getting rid of the minimum is in general a process where you push people, you nudge them to the correct way.
Desired way.
Right. So I agree, Farida, agree with what you're saying. You know, maybe the market knows what to do. And I got, Michael, I read your letter. It's really long, but I understand it's more from the personal view. There's a lot of externality, but if you just jump out of the box, you know, it seems like this is the general direction that maybe we should go for. So for that, I think I'm just gonna, I stand for the maximum, and we should do it citywide. But with all due respect, I think you make really good points. But I just want to, let's not forget about, let's not just drive into those rabbit holes and just jump out. Okay, less driving, more active transportation is good, right? And then this policy in general is pushing us towards that direction, correct? Okay, both clicked. Then for me, at least I should go for it. There's always different way you interpret right, things, and they will be endless.
So let me ask a question about the maximum and the variance process. It seems like one of the things we're considering is imposing the parking maximum in the code, but saying that any developer can ask for a waiver of the maximum for their specific project. And in the past, waivers like that, when it was the reverse kind of waiver for the minimum, was generally approved without a lot of objection. And we're thinking maybe in this case, we would expect a similar high rate of approval for those requests. If we go that route, are we?
What gives you that assumption?
Well, okay. Let's say that we go ahead with. Let's say that we expect, or that basically the commission can approve the variance anytime we want to, and hypothetically, let's suppose that there's a high rate of approval of that. Are we still in compliance with the requirements for those MTC grants if we have a maximum that we don't actually enforce in practice?
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't think we have, I haven't seen, maybe it exists, but I haven't seen the details of what they're looking for. The resolution that MTC passed was just very high level. It said half a parking space maximum.
I'm still wrestling with whether I support the maximum or not. I'm inclined to say I don't support it as a policy, but I could be convinced to support it as something that's in the wording of our regulation, with the understanding that I personally, and maybe some other people in the city, hope that the process for issuing variances will be fairly liberal.
So
Basically, we want it in the code because we want to nudge the city in a certain direction of what kind of development we approve. But if it doesn't work out in practice, we aren't going to be rigid about it. That's kind of the way that I would support the parking maximum.
If I may read to you the findings that would be associated with an exception to the maximum, and there's two. The one is that the applicant, the developer, say, would demonstrate with a parking analysis that additional parking and/or revised parking design is required to meet the anticipated parking demand of the proposed uses. And that second, the provision of the additional parking will not result in an overdependence on vehicles, will not adversely affect public safety, and will not adversely affect transit, bicycle, or pedestrian access to the site or other abutting uses.
That's MTC's rules.
Those are what we're drafting to adopt locally. I don't know what MTC's rules will be.
Oh, well, it seems to me that we're not really clear in the long run where MTC is going to go precisely. So whatever we do should give us the flexibility to change our mind or tailor our response later.
And we can't, we probably will. Usually when we adopt these big picture zoning ordinances, we come back a year or two later and we fix it. We don't want to have to do that all the time, but I would not be surprised if we're back here if this were to be adopted, we have a project or two and we come back and fix it.
So one way to look at that those variance requirements is to say, you can exceed the parking maximum, but only if you really think about it and make a case that it's worth doing in your situation. And that's, I guess that aligns pretty well with the way I'd like the process to work. Do you still feel that that's overly prescriptive?
No, I mean, I appreciate the thoughts around this that everyone's sharing, and I don't feel super strongly about it. I'll float one more kind of hybrid to that, which is, let's go ahead and support the parking maximum citywide, except on designated bike routes. Because I still want to, I don't know how many cases there's going to be where we come back and say, hey, we want to take off all the on-street parking to put in a designated bike lane. But if we do, and nobody has any off-street parking anymore, it's going to be a lot harder for us to do that. I don't know, that's pretty speculative, but if we wanted to have an automatic exemption from the parking maximum that's not totally arbitrary, putting it on designated bike routes would seem like one that fits another policy that we've already got for active transportation. But again, I'm not going to vote no if that's not something people want to go for.
So just thinking about that, Canes and Adams are designated bike routes. Any building built over the entire block from San Pablo to Canes or Adams would then qualify for exemption.
Yeah, if they want to build more off-street parking so the street's less crowded with parked cars, based on all the conversations that have happened so far, it didn't seem very likely that we're going to remove all the parking on one side of Canes or Adams.
I'm just coming up with a hypothetical
Yeah,
that
no.
could affect a lot of the potential built area.
Yeah. And again, nobody has to build to the maximum. The minimums, I think, are the main thing we really want to achieve. If you're going to pay a lot of money, many tens of thousands of dollars to build a parking space, you're not going to do it arbitrarily. You're going to have to feel really strongly that you need it. And so, again, it may be in practice fairly moot. The exemptions to, the parking minimum have been property owners who want to build a bigger house, but if I have to build this parking space, I can't get my bigger house. It's all towards, I need to reduce my costs, I need to fit more on my footprint, take away this requirement so I can do more of what I want to do, and I'll just park on street. I think that's going to continue to be the predominant case. So the parking maximum may in some regards be moot. I'm kind of floating that out as a consideration, but not one that's going to make me change my vote. I'm still going to support this.
Again, I don't want people to be locked into the idea that if you disagree with some element of the planning and zoning proposal, but I don't want people to feel that they have to vote yes because they don't want to vote no on the whole thing. I want to have the opportunity to put forth a different proposal if that's what we as a commission want to do. So I guess I'd like to, in a minute, ask for a straw poll on how people feel about the maximum, and we have a few proposals. One is parking. One is no parking maximum. One is parking maximum just in the Brighton sliver so that we can qualify for the grants. One is parking maximum with an automatic exemption for bike routes. One is parking maximum as planning and zoning proposed it with the exceptions if you do the work and prove that you need the exception. But before I take a straw poll, I want to ask Leo, is Leo, right? Yeah, we haven't heard from you yet, so do you have any thoughts about this?
I'm leaning towards adding the parking maximums, but not including them on the major bike routes.
Mm-hmm.
Just because I think it would be good for cars to be taken off the street more frequently on the bike routes.
Okay. I guess I'm not really excited by that proposal just because I feel like the way to get cars off the street is to price the parking right rather than to provide off-street alternatives, because I don't think that really gets the parking off the street effectively. so I'm less inclined to go with that. But does anybody want to make a comment before I ask for the straw poll? Ken, you're wrinkling your face.
There's lots of stuff going on. I don't think I have a constructive comment.
Okay. So are people pretty clear on the different proposals that I just enumerated? And so how many would most prefer no parking maximum at all? Nobody. How many would most prefer a parking maximum only in the Brighton sliver to comply with grants? That's 3 of us. How many would most prefer the parking maximum with exception for bike routes? And how many would prefer the planning and zoning proposal?
Which is uniformity across the city.
Across the city. Okay, can someone do the math better than me and figure out like
Well,
where's the
I have a question.
Where's the sweet spot here?
I have a question. I'm a little confused about the Brighton sliver. So the Brighton sliver is the space outside of the state law that needs to be covered to conform with the MTC expected guideline?
Right, the state law doesn't make, we don't have to do parking maximum for state law. The only reason we have to do it for compliance purposes is if we want those MTC grants. And then we only have to do it in that northern sliver of the city near the El Cerrito BART station.
Okay.
So that,
It's like 15 houses south of Brighton.
So I think, if I may jump in here, I found a diagram. I don't think this is kind of a CAD drawing, but it's a little, I think I misspoke a little bit. It's a little bit more than a sliver.
Down to Garfield.
It goes to Garfield.
okay.
So it on San Pablo, it goes to Clay, a little bit beyond Clay, a little bit to Garfield, kind of middle school area, and then back into El Cerrito. So in terms of future development projects, it's probably just right around the bowling alley area, and then this block between Brighton and the city limit where there tends to be more multifamily housing, where there's more likely to be multifamily housing in the future. South of Brighton is primarily, as you all know, single-family homes. Pretty unlikely that we'll see somebody buy a bunch of single-family homes. So I misspoke, but I think the reality of how this is going to play out and where it would apply as a practical matter is that first block or so.
Okay, so Ken, are you clear on what we mean by the Brighton?
Yes,
what I
thank
mean
you.
when I say the Brighton sliver, whether it's a sliver or
Yes,
not?
that does not change my raised hand.
Okay. All right, so let's put aside the bike lane proposal because I think that one got the least amount of support, and the no parking maximum at all got no support. So I think between the 2 most popular options, which are parking maximum citywide as in the planning and zoning proposal, or parking maximum only as needed to qualify for MTC grants. I've lost track of the preponderance of votes between.
Why don't you
those.
do another straw poll?
So the straw poll between those 2 options, parking maximum just to qualify for MTC grants, is 2 of us, or 3 of us? Can we
Yeah,
put the
3.
hands up high
See
so I
3.
can see? 4 of us.
4, okay.
So I think that is the preference of the commission. Would anyone prefer to have that be as a separate motion that we can make a formal vote on, or are we content
Sure.
going ahead with?
Yeah, that way we can at least have, I'm presuming, closer to unanimity on the parking minimums.
Yeah.
So-
Yeah, I think it would be good to be on the record as saying that we all want to move, presumably we all, everybody who
Michael?
I want to give everyone a chance to vote to approve the general proposal, and I want to give some of us the chance to vote for the change that we're
Well-
suggesting. Or,
If I can waiver.
okay,
I guess I don't really care, but I do think that uniformity for the sake of city staff is probably the right way to go.
useful, yeah.
I guess I also don't know the scale of the grants that MTC performance would give us.
So how can we do this as two motions?
Oh, it's easy. We just,
May I just jump in for a moment? I noticed that the chair of the Planning and Zoning Commission is on the Zoom.
Oh, do they have would they?
The hand is not raised, but
I'd really like to hear from them if
I
they.
was wondering if you
speak
might
to
want
the
to-
rationale. Before we
so-
do that, can I have a motion to extend the meeting?
I move that we extend the meeting to 10 PM.
and I
Do we
don't-
have a second?
a second.
Okay, let's just say all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay.
So I don't know if Nick Pilch, if you're there, the hand ran up. Great. I'm going to allow him to speak. Oh, I don't have access. Can you do it? Do you want to see if we can?
While we're waiting for that, I'd like to credit former Commissioner and Councilmember Peggy McQuaid. Commissioner Barnes, about 10 years ago, on this commission, Peggy made a concerted effort to increase the number of ADA parking spaces on Solano. And so you have her to thank for those specific spaces, and you should give her thanks.
I will. I'm having breakfast with her tomorrow.
Good.
I'll remember. They could use some fresh paint, however. They could use some fresh paint, however.
Yeah. There we go. Nick, you can go ahead now.
Sure, thanks. I'm not, I apologize, I have been listening, but not to everything. I did hear Chair of the Planning and Zoning Commission mentioned. Could you ask me a specific question so I can know what to speak on exactly?
Well, the question I started with is that in the memo that was accompanying this agenda item, there were a lot of reasons given why we should eliminate a parking minimum citywide. And there were not a lot of reasons given why we should impose a parking maximum. And one reason that's been offered is we have to do it to qualify for MTC grants, but there's only a small portion of the city where that really applies. So what's the rationale for saying we should apply the parking maximum rule citywide instead of just in the part that is required to comply to qualify for grants? Convince us that it's a good idea to have a parking maximum citywide.
Well, I think we were, as you probably heard, we were divided on that. And I guess those of us who thought we should have it citywide were thinking that it reduces the administrative burden on the staff, and it also conforms with our climate action and housing production goals, to put it very briefly. In general, housing is going to be more difficult to build. It's going to be more expensive to build the more parking spaces there are. And although, you know, that's perhaps some might think that's a question up to the developer, it is more in our policy that we want more. It does conform, I think, with our policies more that we want more of the housing, the more of the parking, and also conforms more with our climate action goals. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it.
Okay, thank you. I think that aligns pretty well with what we've been hearing and what Fareed said in his devil's advocate role. So Fareed, it sounded like you had an idea for how to formulate a motion on this parking maximum issue that would be separate from our vote on the overall proposal.
Yeah, I think we just split the item into two motions. So I'm happy to make two motions. The first motion is to approve the staff recommendation with respect to the parking minimums. And the second motion that I'll make is to approve the staff recommendation with respect to the parking maximums, but only within the half mile of the El Cerrito BART station in order to be eligible for MTC's One Bay Area grant program.
My question is, if I vote no on that, does that means that I would like to get rid of maximum parking?
Right, that does-
Or,
No, so, right, so what happens then is if we all vote yes on the first one, or we pass the first one, but we don't pass the second motion, then I or another commissioner can make a subsequent motion to replace it. And in this case, based on the straw poll, that would be a motion to have parking maximums as recommended in the staff report citywide.
All right, can I offer a friendly amendment? Would that come before the second?
Yes,
Yeah.
either
Friendly
way.
amendment that the first motion be worded to approve the planning and zoning recommendation with regard to everything except the parking maximum.
Yes, I accept that.
I will second your first motion.
Thank you.
Okay, so we now have a motion, one motion and a second. So the motion is, can we clarify again what the motion is?
So the motion, and forgive me if I get it not quite right, is to approve the planning and zoning recommendation except with respect to the parking maximums, which we will decide separately.
Okay, that's moved and seconded, so let's take a vote.
Commissioner Barnes,
No.
Commissioner Javandel,
Aye.
Commissioner McCroskey,
Yes.
Commissioner Peng,
yes.
Commissioner Vihil McClanahan,
Aye.
Commissioner Von Nightingale,
Aye.
Chair Chomsky.
Yes.
Motion carries.
So now we would need either a second on the second motion or an alternate motion.
Ken, would you like to propose an alternate since you seconded only?
Well, I would just like to mention that Chair Pilch brought up the policies that the city has in place that the parking maximums align with in terms of encouraging alternative transportation and carbon reduction. I don't think we've really touched on that much specifically as a policy. So I'd like to add those to the things that I've said before in support of parking maximums.
Okay, so you're not asking to change the motion, you just wanted to speak before taking?
I did want to speak on that, and I'm willing to posit a different motion, if this is the moment for that.
Sure.
Then I will move that we recommend the parking maximums as recommended by the, Planning and Zoning Commission.
Okay, let's
I
take,
second that.
let's take a vote on that.
Commissioner Barnes,
I'm sorry, can you restate that for me, please?
That we recommend the parking maximums as outlined in the materials provided by staff tonight as recommended by Planning and Zoning.
No.
Commissioner Javandel,
I'm going to vote no on that.
Commissioner McCroskey,
Yes.
Commissioner Peng,
Yes.
Commissioner Vihil McClanahan,
Yes.
Commissioner Von Nightingale,
No.
Chair Chomsky.
No. I believe it carries, right? Or did it not?
That's two yeas, does not carry.
It doesn't carry.
Doesn't carry, okay.
So we can
Fareed, your
either
motion was on the floor but not seconded.
not seconded. And I will say I'd be perfectly happy to start splitting the difference and going to the bike routes only exemption, but I recognize that that adds more complexity for staff, and every time the bike plan changes, it would tweak it again.
I just also want to add to that, I really like Albany to have like a dedicated bike lane, but as you point out, it's possibly speculative, right, in your proposal. And then possibly removing, changing people's behavior, get them on more on active transportation might be more helpful, and then we just do mixed flow, might be a more realistic future. Just one comment.
Would anybody like to, so you put the bike lane idea forward, but it seems like you're not ready to move it.
I'll move it if someone will second it. I mean, to move forward, we need some motion that gets seconded,
Okay.
because the other alternative is that we are proceeding with no parking.
Well, since the one I second is not passed, I would love to second yours. It's better than just do the bare minimum.
Okay, so which
ahead.
one? The bike lanes? Or
The bike lanes, yes, better than just do the sliver, right?
So wait, so the bike lanes with the crescent or without the crescent?
Yes, with.
Okay.
I think the bare minimum is that we maintain eligibility for the OBAG grants. And then the more aggressive parking maximums is that the only exemption other than that sliver, I'm sorry, the sliver gets the parking maximum and everything in the city gets the parking maximum except the designated bikeways.
So the only exceptions would be the designated bikeways?
Yes. Because the sliver is not an exception. It's the part that needs it the most. It needs the parking maximum to qualify for the OBAG grant.
So the exception is the designated bikeways outside of the sliver.
Yes.
That makes it really hard to change designated bikeways, doesn't it?
I think.
Well,
that
the
would-
designated bikeways can change anytime they need to, but then it means that the parking maximum goes away anytime we change the bikeways, which is why I was kind of trying to go with a broader brush with just have the sliver with the parking maximum, and citywide, we're flexible with where we do. Again, I don't think anyone's going to push to build more parking, but I don't want to preclude the odd case where that becomes necessary or require them to jump through a lot of hoops, given that we'd likely approve it anyway.
So is that clear?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you brought up a downside of this, which is something that I think you brought up, one of you, I can't remember, brought up a minute ago, reinforced by what Ken just said. So can you restate that motion and see if we get a second?
So my first motion was to approve the planning and zoning recommendations of parking maximums, but only within the half-mile radius of the El Cerrito BART station in order to maintain eligibility with the OBAG grants.
And that hasn't yet been seconded.
That has not been seconded. The substitute motion is to approve the planning and zoning recommendation with respect to parking maximums except on designated bike routes. And that should the designated bike routes change in future, that the parking maximum would be removed from those designated bike routes in future as well.
Okay, but don't we need to have it apply to, the parking maximums apply to all of the El Cerrito BART sliver and outside the sliver except on bike routes?
I'm going to make a
You're going to simplify.
presumption here. Well, I think that by not trying to mix the two, the only situation is if we have a designated bike route within that sliver and MTC says, hey, you're violating our rules. But if we say to MTC, our general rule is parking maximums, but we have designated exceptions, that they're likely to say that's substantially in compliance and you're eligible for the grant. A little bit of a gamble, but I feel pretty strongly it's
Getting a nod
nuanced
from
enough.
staff.
Yeah.
I don't think MTC is going to be unreasonable. I mean, we're on the same page.
Yeah, we're giving them a reason, and it's, I think, a good reason.
Okay, so are people clear on what the current motion is? And are you prepared to second?
Yeah, I second that.
Okay. Let's take a vote.
Restate the motion.
So the motion is that we approve the planning and zoning recommendation for parking maximums except on designated bike routes, and that if the city changes the designated bike routes in future, the parking maximum will be removed from those future designated bike routes as well.
I second that. Michael, is that clear?
Okay.
In that case, I second that.
Okay, we're ready for a vote. Or does staff have a comment before we take a vote?
When you say designated bike route, are you like class 2 route or?
I don't want to be so
Okay,
limiting, exactly.
okay.
Okay. Commissioner Barnes,
No.
Commissioner Javandel,
Aye.
Commissioner McCroskey,
No.
Commissioner Peng,
Yes.
Commissioner Vihil McClanahan,
Yes.
Commissioner Von Neidingen,
Aye.
Chair Chomsky.
No.
Motion carries.
Motion carries. Okay. Then we do not need another motion.
Next item.
So I think there are some of us maybe who would have voted yes on a motion to approve parking maximums only in the El Cerrito BART zone, but we don't need to take a vote on that because, well, there's some of us who would have voted yes on it. I'm not saying that motion would have carried.
I just want to say thank you to all of you for a really nuanced and thoughtful conversation and process. We're not often so closely split, but at the same time, we're really close.
And it sounds like planning and zoning was split on the same issue, maybe not in exactly the same way, but it's clearly a point of.
I think you've given it a great deal of thought, and they did a lot of work, but I don't think they spent as much time on this particular aspect of it as you did, so thank you.
That seems appropriate. It'll be interesting to see what council does with it.
Okay, I think we have completed item 5-1 unless anybody has further comments. Okay, let's take a breath. I would like to try to get through 5-2 quickly and still have time for something else before the end of the meeting. I think 5-2 is a fairly simple one that we can cover in a few minutes.
I think so,
into it?
yes. So this item is discussion on the formation of a subcommittee related to zero emission transportation. This was at the request of Climate Action Committee, Zero Emission Transportation Subcommittee that's asked to engage the Transportation Commission on this topic. There were questions regarding open meeting requirements, which I've attempted to detail out in the memo. An individual member of the Transportation Commission is free to participate in discussions with the subcommittee and share information or expertise with that advisory body without triggering open meeting requirements. If the participation is intended to lead to a potential action by the Transportation Commission, the Commission should establish an ad hoc subcommittee to represent the Commission and report back. Two subcommittees can meet jointly without a public meeting, without violating, they can meet without triggering a public meeting and Brown Act requirements if certain criteria are met. And these include not having a quorum of either of the committees or commissions, which now that we're a 7-member body would be up to 3 members of the Transportation Commission. And each subcommittee would be reporting back to their respective advisory body on the discussion and proposing any potential action for consideration by the whole advisory body. So you wouldn't be delegating the joint meetings to take any action. Any action would be considered in a public meeting in this forum as a report out by the subcommittee this commission establishes for potential action. The other element of this is that the subcommittee meetings must be ad hoc, meaning they exist for a specific purpose and as necessary, not a standing subcommittee. And this means that the scope of the conversation should be limited to the purpose that this body would set out. And going above that threshold to be a separate Brown Act public noticed meeting would be if the subcommittees were tasked with making a recommendation to council or they included a quorum from either body. So recommendation if the commission desires now or at a future meeting after discussing the topic to identify the name and purpose of the subcommittee and to consider nominating and selecting members to participate in those discussions. The memo also detailed a couple city council strategic plan elements that could be relevant for the discussion. One being to explore opportunities for shuttle service to connect community to business areas, and the other being encouraging shared mobility programs and increasing access to electric vehicles and charging infrastructure. Sorry, no, that's the climate action plan element. The other strategic goal item is explore opportunities to facilitate electric vehicle charging. So those are the two council items, strategic items that could be relevant for the discussion. The other item I just referenced in relation to looking at shared mobility or shuttle kind of services, there is the AC Transit Realign planning effort that is underway that's looking at service throughout the AC Transit service area. And with that, happy to answer additional questions on it.
How many members are there of the Climate Action Committee? 7.
So
this subcommittee could be as large as 3 from each, so it could be up to 6 people.
That's correct.
And have they nominated anybody to be on the subcommittee, or?
They have a subcommittee, yes. And the members of the subcommittee are the ones who originally were.
So if we had a
requesting
joint subcommittee, it would be those same people from the existing Climate Action Subcommittee plus whoever we choose from our subcommittee, from our commission?
Correct. This commission could form a subcommittee on the same or relevant topic, and those two subcommittees could meet and discuss.
So they'd technically be two different subcommittees that could meet with each other?
Correct.
Okay. And when there's a meeting of a subcommittee with or without joining with the others, is there any rule about how many members of that subcommittee need to be present? Like if people said, oh, I don't feel like going tonight, can you still have the meeting?
It's no decision making, it's just discussion and developing ideas to bring back to your respective advisory bodies. So there's not a quorum kind of requirement or membership requirement.
So there can be a meeting with any subset of the people who are members of the two subcommittees. Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, just follow up on my previous question. How many people are on the subcommittee from Climate Action?
I know of 2. I'm not sure if it's 2 or 3.
So we'd probably want to have the same number of people from this committee.
Sounds like we don't have to have the same number, but that could be something we discuss.
From a practical standpoint, the meetings will be scheduled probably on an ad hoc basis, and it might be advantageous to have 3 members of our subcommittee in case their schedules don't align well.
Well, let's get into that after we finish with questions. So do we have anybody online who would like to comment on this?
Raise your hand if you would like to speak on this. Not seeing any.
Okay. I'll take comments from the commission. Do you want to follow up with what you were just saying, Ken?
Well, I'm saying that from a practical standpoint, I know I've tried to meet with the subcommittee, and I think Commissioner Javadal has as well, and our schedules didn't quite mesh. So even if you have 3 people on the subcommittee, that doesn't mean they're all going to make every meeting. And so I would suggest that 3 might be a good number.
And the subcommittee doesn't have a chair or anything like that. There's no privileged members of the subcommittee. Everybody's equal.
Correct.
So before us tonight is whether to create such a subcommittee, and if we do, then who will be on it?
I'm sorry, the last part there,
If we do, then who will be on it?
right? And what charge we give it? What is the purpose, stated purpose of the ad hoc committee? Assuming we want an ad hoc committee.
And that stated purpose doesn't have to perfectly align with the stated purpose of the Climate Action Subcommittee. If the intention is for them to meet with each other, they can still have slightly different missions. As long as each one has a well-defined mission that's not permanent. Okay. So I think, Ken, was the impetus of this came from you, right?
Well, it came from conversations that I had with a member of the Climate Action Committee. So it kind of came from them,
Yeah.
and I brought it up previously. I'm trying to formulate a mission or a stated charge to the subcommittee.
But while you do that, does anyone else have any general thoughts, pro or con, about how to move forward with this?
Yeah, I just would want to ask the question, what problem are we trying to solve with this subcommittee? If we don't have a clear idea what the problem is, then we run into situations like the old waterfront committee, which I think really didn't have a charge by the end of its existence, but it was still tough to get rid of it. And SCJC, Social and Economic Justice Commission, which is no longer called that, has always had a very murky charge, and I think never really was effective because of that. So I think if we do this, we ought to have a concrete idea of what is going to be delivered and when, and because otherwise this could kind of drift around for a while. That's just been my experience.
That's a good point, and I think it aligns with the rules that we've already heard from staff, that it has to have a well-defined mission that is that's finite in scope, that has a logical endpoint.
Yeah, that's fair. And so one of the reasons that this has come up is that the Climate Action Committee sees a lot of nexus between future planning of the Transportation Commission, things like the update to the Active Transportation Plan, that they would like to contribute to and have discussions about. It's cumbersome to involve both full bodies in the process. So this would be an attempt to have, eddies working on ideas that could feed into both of those bodies outside of the direct normal meeting process. And we can be specific about that. I think for me, another driving thing behind this is our recent process with parklets and the updated rules for parklets, in which we found inefficiencies in working with other bodies on those rules. And I know you weren't around for that, but basically we ended up sort of talking past each other and not really coming to consensus. And I think the goal. Yep.
That's a good example of where there actually was a very limited scope to the topic to be discussed. And if we had gone the route of creating subcommittees on the topic of parklet rules, that would have had a logical endpoint. So
Yes.
if we can formulate this in a similarly contained way, I think that might meet everybody's wishes.
So my understanding is maybe the best way is whenever some item emerge, then we form it, instead of let's form it first and figure out what to do with it, correct?
Right, and in this case, the
Active transportation plan?
the proposal is to align the planning processes of the Transportation Commission with the climate action goals of the city in terms of reducing vehicle miles traveled and providing enhanced electric vehicle charging.
Do we have an input to the
Can you speak closer to the mic?
sorry. Do we have any input into the AC Transit realign process? Is that something that we could work with the climate subcommittee, the Climate Action Committee on formulating? As, you know, fairly impactful. We have plenty of transit underserved neighborhoods around here.
That would be one potential avenue. That was not one that was brought up by the Climate Action Committee member that I spoke with.
Are you talking about the ACTC plans for revamping San Pablo Avenue?
No,
DC Transit service planning effort that's underway this year.
Choosing how the bus routes should be modified to meet today's needs.
With today's resources.
Yeah. So I have to say I'm a little fuzzy on what, like with the parklets, there was a clear agenda item that had to be resolved. With this, I'm not yet clear on what that is, and I'm a little worried that the scope of this is too nebulous. When we talk about encouraging active transportation, that's something this commission is doing every month of every year and will
Right.
continue to do for many years, and I don't want this subcommittee to have a scope that's that broad.
Right,
If it
and I
could
was
be-
attempting to formulate a narrower,
Okay,
let me restate that.
okay, go ahead.
If I can. And that would be to reduce vehicle miles traveled and to provide enhanced electric vehicle charging.
I'm not really comfortable with having reduced vehicle miles traveled as a mission of the subcommittee because, again, I think it's something that's a permanent part of our mission. We're not going to come to an endpoint with that.
I agree. I think that, that everything we've done in the active transportation plan is around reducing vehicle miles traveled, reducing emissions. And it is an underlying, to me, mission of the Transportation Commission to do those things. So my concern, while I think those conversations are good, is that from our perspective, it's really broad. The maybe slightly less broad, but useful function of this would be to share our knowledge and expertise with their subcommittee. I don't feel like there's anything at this point that I would want our subcommittee to go out and then come back with recommendations for us to do beyond things we're already doing. So if it were to say, hey, for 6 months, let's meet with them and share information, to inform them about our existing policies and, approach, maybe that's useful. I'm not 100% sold on that, but that's the most useful that I see right now.
Right, and it is, as stated in the memo, there is the opportunity for an individual member of the commission to meet with their subcommittee currently without taking any action.
And we don't even have to form a subcommittee to do that, right?
That's correct.
But if two of us together wanted to meet with them, would we have to form a subcommittee to do that?
Not if you're not representing the commission or tasked by the commission to.
Right, if we wanted to report back to the commission on what we learned in that meeting during, say, announcements or something at the end of, not as an agenda item, would that be fair game?
Then it would be better to form a subcommittee if you're going to confer with their subcommittee and reporting back to the.
Even if it's just one person, it should still be a subcommittee.
If you're acting on behalf of the commission, maybe it could just be an action from the commission to authorize someone to go.
Yeah, I think maybe you don't call it a subcommittee, but if someone goes to say, hey, the Transportation Commission talked about this and we struggled with why we're doing this, you should probably designate one of you to send that message.
A liaison.
I would move that we appoint Ken as liaison to the Zero Emission Transportation Subcommittee of the Climate Action Committee. If that's not putting you on the spot too much, Ken.
No, that sounds reasonable.
I'll second that.
Okay. Should we have a vote?
Commissioner Barnes,
Yes.
Commissioner Javandel,
Aye.
Commissioner McCroskey,
Yes.
Commissioner Peng,
Yes.
Commissioner Vihil McClanahan,
Yes.
Commissioner Von Neidingen,
Yes.
Chair Chomsky.
Yes.
Motion carries.
I'm not doing this just because I'm looking for another title or task.
But I'd just like to observe that if you come back from that with a clearer statement of what subcommittee you want to create and what its mission will be, we can consider forming a more full-fledged subcommittee.
Yeah, if it is to become more clear and more specific, the scope become more specified, I would love to form a subcommittee.
Agreed.
Great. That's clear to me, and it may be that as we get closer to or into an ATP revision, that may become more important. So we'll start with this.
Good.
Thank you.
We need a few more minutes.
The following item can be continued if you.
Yeah, we can continue the following item, but I think we need a few more minutes even to get through.
I move we go till 10:10 at the max.
I'll second.
All in favor? I'm sorry.
Aye, yeah, all in favor. All in favor?
Gotta say it.
Aye.
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 Anybody not in favor?
My children.
All right, I suggest we not take on vehicle injury collision data at this time. So let's have announcements.
Main announcements, I have our one AC Transit's Realign, which we already discussed. Their first materials from the staff is expected to be presented to the AC Transit Board at its July 26th meeting, which is the day before the next commission meeting. So letting you know that now. They're supposed to be presenting on findings from the first phase community outreach, their existing conditions analysis, and draft guiding principles. So that'll be the first report out from staff on this effort. Other announcement item is that council did approve the intersection red curb policy as recommended by the commission at last month's meeting.
Any announcements from commission members?
One other is that we expect the Alameda County Transportation Commission San Pablo Avenue multimodal projects presentation to go to council at their July 17th meeting.
So the whole controversy around the Washington crossing and all that hasn't appeared in front of council yet since we discussed it?
Correct.
Okay. Future agenda items, obviously the injury collision data.
Expecting sidewalk maintenance and street lighting updates at the next month's meeting.
Anything else?
Would it be possible to request an update on phase 2 of the Brighton traffic calming project? To ride a personal hobby horse?
Is there a time that would be ideal for you to do that, or?
I can give very briefly, there's a major sewer project that will be taking, planned is to move a sewer that's currently north of Brighton to under private property to Brighton. So partly we're wanting the Brighton project to go after that major work. So it's
Okay.
probably a couple years out.
Okay, thank you.
So is that enough of an update, or would you like to have it agendized for?
I mean,
More detail.
I can watch the progress of EB Mud redoing that from my window. Like I'm actually on one of the most affected streets of that particular sewer collapse. So thank you.
Okay, our next meeting is July 27th, and this meeting is adjourned. Thank you all.
Take it easy.
Thanks.